Apperception. Apperception is the psychological process through which every new experience is interpreted through the residue of what came before it. Nothing enters the mind untouched. Each sight, sound, gesture, or sentence is immediately compared against memories, expectations, beliefs, and emotional associations that already live inside you. This silent comparison happens so fast that it feels like reality itself, even though it is a constructed meaning layered onto the present moment. This is why the same situation can feel safe to one person and threatening to another. The event does not change, but the internal lens does. Apperception turns perception into interpretation, and interpretation into emotion. A raised eyebrow can feel like judgment. A delayed response can feel like rejection. The mind fills in gaps using its own history. From early childhood, emotionally charged experiences begin forming mental templates. Moments of praise, neglect, fear, or warmth leave imprints that quietly organize future perception. When a similar pattern appears later in life, the brain responds before conscious thought has time to intervene. The past activates itself inside the present. This process also explains why people remain trapped in familiar emotional loops. The mind seeks coherence more than truth. What is familiar feels safer than what is unknown, even if familiarity carries pain. Apperception rewards predictability, allowing old interpretations to override new information. In relationships, apperception shapes attraction, conflict, and misunderstanding. You are not responding only to the person in front of you, but to echoes of others who came before them. Authority, intimacy, criticism, and silence all awaken stored meanings. Without awareness, these meanings dictate reactions automatically, shaping behavior, self-worth, and choice. Signal detection. Signal detection is the psychological process by which the mind decides what is meaningful and what is noise. At every moment, your senses are flooded with far more information than you could ever consciously process. Sounds overlap, visual details blur together, thoughts compete for attention. Signal detection is what determines which of these inputs breaks through and becomes something you notice, react to, or emotionally register. This process is never neutral. Your expectations, fears, motivations, and past experiences all tune the mind's internal filter. When you are anxious, the mind becomes hypersensitive, detecting threats that may not truly exist. A harmless tone can feel hostile. A neutral silence can feel ominous. When you are hopeful or distracted, the opposite happens. You may miss warning signs that were always there. Signal detection explains why people disagree about what really happened. One person insists they saw the warning signs. Another swears there were none. The difference lies not in reality, but in sensitivity. The mind constantly balances two types of errors, detecting a signal that isn't there or missing a signal that is. Both come with emotional consequences. This mechanism evolved to protect survival. Missing danger could be fatal, so the brain often favors false alarms over silence. But in modern life, this same system can exhaust the nervous system. When the mind is tuned too tightly, everything feels urgent. Every look feels loaded. Every pause feels personal. Signal detection also shapes confidence and self-doubt. People who repeatedly miss signals begin to distrust themselves. Those who constantly detect threats may feel trapped in vigilance. Without awareness, this filtering process silently controls relationships, decisions, and emotional reactions. You are not simply responding to the world, you are responding to what your mind decides is worth noticing long before logic has a chance to speak. Sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is the psychological process by which the mind slowly stops responding to constant stimulation. What is present all the time fades into the background, not because it disappears, but because the brain decides it no longer deserves attention. This quiet filtering allows you to function without being overwhelmed, but it also shapes how reality feels in ways you rarely notice. At first, a sensation can feel intense. A strong smell fills the room. A sound feels impossible to ignore. A touch demands awareness. Then, without effort or permission, the intensity softens. The mind adjusts. What once stood out becomes normal. This happens so gradually that it feels natural, even inevitable. Sensory adaptation explains why comfort can become invisible. A steady source of warmth, safety, or stability stops registering emotionally. The nervous system labels it as expected and shifts attention elsewhere. At the same time, discomfort that is constant can also fade, which is why people can endure environments or relationships that once felt unbearable. The mind adapts not for happiness, but for efficiency. This process protects mental energy, but it comes with a cost. Because the brain adapts, it pushes you to seek change, novelty, or intensity just to feel something again. What once satisfied now feels dull. What once felt exciting now feels flat. The absence of stimulation can feel like emptiness, even when nothing is wrong. Sensory adaptation also shapes emotional perception. Repeated exposure to criticism, tension, or stress can normalize emotional strain. Over time, the body accepts it as baseline. People stop noticing how much they are carrying until the stimulus is removed and relief finally registers. Without awareness, sensory adaptation quietly rewrites your emotional standards. It decides what feels normal, what feels missing, and what you no longer question. You don't always lose feeling because something is gone. Sometimes you lose feeling because it stayed. Perceptual constancy. Perceptual constancy is the psychological process that allows the world to feel stable even when sensory input is constantly changing. Objects shift in light, distance, angle, and motion, yet your mind insists they remain the same. A door stays the same size as you walk toward it. A face remains familiar in shadow or brightness. Without this mechanism, reality would feel chaotic and unreliable. This stability is not a property of the world itself, but of the mind interpreting it. Your brain corrects for changes automatically, preserving meaning over accuracy. It fills in gaps, smooths inconsistencies, and protects you from having to relearn reality every second. What feels obvious is actually an active psychological construction. Perceptual constancy also shapes emotional experience. When the mind expects continuity, it resists change even when change is real. People are perceived as who they were, not who they are becoming. Early impressions harden into fixed identities. A single mistake can redefine someone, or a past role can trap them long after it no longer fits. This process creates comfort, but it also creates blindness. The brain prefers consistency over updating its model of reality. Evidence that contradicts what is already known is softened, ignored, or reinterpreted. This is why people can miss warning signs in relationships, workplaces, or themselves. The mind holds onto the familiar shape of things even as they shift. Perceptual constancy allows trust in the environment, but it also fuels denial. It keeps the world predictable while quietly resisting truth that disrupts emotional balance. When reality changes slowly, the mind often lags behind, maintaining the illusion of sameness. You do not perceive what is, you perceive what your mind decides should remain constant. In this way, stability can become a shield, protecting comfort while delaying awareness of change that has already arrived. Figure ground perception. Figure ground perception is the psychological process through which the mind decides what deserves focus and what fades into the background. At any moment, your senses receive more information than you could ever consciously process. The brain resolves this overload by separating one element as the figure, something clear and meaningful, while everything else becomes the ground, something present but largely ignored. This process feels automatic, but it is deeply influenced by emotion, motivation, and personal relevance. What you are anxious about rises to the foreground. What feels safe or familiar recedes into the background. A single word in a conversation can suddenly dominate your awareness, while the rest dissolves. The mind chooses what matters before you realize a choice was made. Figure ground perception explains why people can be surrounded by support and still feel alone. The mind may elevate one sign of rejection into focus while pushing countless signs of care into the background. What you attend to becomes your emotional reality, even when it is not the whole picture. This mechanism also shapes conflict. In moments of tension, the mind isolates a gesture, a tone, or a phrase and turns it into the entire story. Context disappears, intention fades, the background is lost, and the figure feels absolute. The brain seeks clarity, even if clarity comes at the cost of accuracy. Over time, repeated focus strengthens patterns. What you habitually treat as figure grows louder. What you consistently push into the ground becomes invisible. Gratitude, stability, and quiet connection often fade, while threat and dissatisfaction sharpen. Figure ground perception is not just about vision. It organizes thought, emotion, and meaning. It decides what feels urgent, what feels personal, and what is overlooked. Without awareness, this silent sorting process shapes mood, relationships, and self-image, not by changing reality, but by narrowing what you allow yourself to truly see. Change blindness. Change blindness is the psychological phenomenon that reveals how easily the mind overlooks even dramatic changes when attention is elsewhere. You assume you would notice if something important shifted in front of you, but the truth is far more unsettling. The brain does not record reality like a camera. It samples, predicts, and fills in gaps, often convincing you that what you last saw is still what exists now. This happens because attention is limited and selective. When the mind is focused on one task, one detail, or one expectation, everything else becomes background. A person can disappear from a scene. An object can move. A detail can reverse entirely. If your attention is not directed at the moment of change, the mind simply does not register it. Instead, it preserves the previous version of reality. Change blindness exposes how much of perception is assumption. The brain prioritizes continuity over accuracy, preferring a stable story to constant updating. This makes life feel smooth and coherent, but it also creates vulnerability. Important signals can be missed not because they were subtle, but because the mind decided they were irrelevant. Emotion intensifies this effect. When people are stressed, distracted, or emotionally invested in a particular outcome, change blindness becomes stronger. Warning signs in relationships, gradual shifts in behavior, or slow erosion of trust often go unnoticed until they reach a breaking point. By then, the change feels sudden, even though it was happening all along. This phenomenon explains why people say they changed overnight, when in reality, the mind simply failed to notice incremental shifts. It also explains why environments, routines, and even personal identity can transform without conscious awareness. Change blindness is not a flaw of vision, but a consequence of how the brain protects mental energy. Yet, this protection comes at a cost. When attention narrows too much, reality updates without permission. You don't miss change because it was invisible. You miss it because your mind decided the old version was safer to keep believing. Inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is the psychological phenomenon that reveals how much of reality you never actually see. When attention is focused on one task, one goal, or one emotional concern, the mind silently blocks out everything else, even things that are obvious, meaningful, or directly in front of you. The world does not disappear, but awareness does. This blindness is not a flaw of vision, but a consequence of attention. The brain has limited capacity, so it prioritizes what seems relevant and suppresses what does not. When you are deeply focused, the mind narrows. Unexpected details fail to register. You can look directly at something and still have no memory of seeing it. Inattentional blindness explains why people miss clear signs in their environment and in their lives. A relationship can change slowly while someone insists everything is fine. A warning sign can appear repeatedly without ever becoming conscious. The mind, occupied elsewhere, edits reality in real time. Emotion intensifies this effect. Stress, fear, obsession, and desire all tighten attention. When emotions run high, awareness shrinks. You notice only what confirms the current focus and overlook what challenges it. This is why people say the truth was right there after it is pointed out. It was present all along, just unseen. This phenomenon also shapes self-perception. People can overlook their own exhaustion, resentment, or unhappiness because attention is fixed on functioning, pleasing, or surviving. The mind filters out internal signals just as easily as external ones. Inattentional blindness is unsettling because it reveals a lack of control. You assume seeing is passive and automatic, but awareness is selective and fragile. Entire experiences can pass through your senses without ever becoming part of your reality. What you miss is not random. It is determined by where your attention lives, what it fears, and what it refuses to look at. Top-down processing. Top-down processing is the psychological mechanism through which the mind uses prior knowledge, expectations, beliefs, and emotional states to interpret incoming sensory information. Instead of perception starting purely from what your senses receive, it often begins with what your mind already assumes. You don't just see the world, you predict it, then adjust what you notice to fit those predictions. This process allows perception to feel fast and effortless. The brain fills in missing details, completes incomplete information, and assigns meaning before conscious thought can catch up. A few visual cues become a full object. A partial sentence becomes a clear intention. This efficiency keeps you functioning, but it also means perception is deeply biased toward what you expect to find. Top-down processing explains why first impressions are so powerful. Once the mind forms an expectation about a person or situation, it actively looks for confirmation. Neutral behaviors are reinterpreted to match the existing narrative. Kindness becomes manipulation. Silence becomes judgment. The mind is not seeking truth. It is seeking consistency. Emotion strongly influences this mechanism. Fear sharpens threat detection. Desire amplifies opportunity. In moments of stress, the brain relies even more heavily on past experience, overriding present evidence. This is why anxiety makes harmless situations feel dangerous and why hope can make warning signs disappear. Top-down processing also shapes memory. What you remember is not a perfect recording, but a reconstruction guided by belief. Over time, memories shift to better align with the story you already tell yourself. The mind edits reality to preserve coherence. This process gives the illusion of certainty. You feel sure of what you saw, heard, or understood, even when perception was guided more by expectation than evidence. Without awareness, top-down processing quietly narrows perspective, reinforcing assumptions and emotional reactions. You experience reality not as it arrives, but as it is predicted, and once a prediction feels real enough, the mind rarely questions it. Bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is the psychological mechanism through which the mind builds understanding, starting from raw sensory input. Information flows from the outside in. Light hits the eyes, sound reaches the ears, physical sensations register in the body, and only then does the brain begin assembling meaning. Perception begins with data, not assumption. This process allows reality to surprise you. Because interpretation starts with what is actually present, bottom-up processing can interrupt expectations and challenge beliefs. A new sound demands attention. An unfamiliar face feels vivid. A sudden change in tone instantly shifts emotional awareness. The mind is forced to respond to what is happening now rather than what it predicted would happen. Bottom-up processing is strongest when something is novel, intense, or unexpected. The unfamiliar breaks through mental filters and commands focus. This is why sudden noises startle you, why pain is immediate, and why new environments feel overwhelming at first. The brain cannot rely on memory alone, so it listens closely to the senses. Emotionally, this process is grounding but vulnerable. Without the buffer of expectation, sensations can feel raw and unfiltered. Joy can feel overwhelming. Fear can surge before logic intervenes. The body reacts first, and meaning follows later. This is why certain sounds, smells, or touches can trigger powerful emotional responses before you understand why. As experiences repeat, bottom-up processing slowly gives way to expectation-driven interpretation. The mind learns patterns and begins predicting instead of sensing. While this saves energy, it dulls awareness. Moments blur together. Sensations lose sharpness. Bottom-up processing reminds you what it feels like to truly notice. It pulls attention out of memory and into immediacy. In those moments, the world feels louder, brighter, and more alive. The mind stops narrating and starts receiving, allowing experience to exist before judgment has time to reshape it. Neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the psychological and biological capacity of the brain to change itself. It is the reason experience leaves a physical mark. Every thought you repeat, every emotion you dwell in, every behavior you rehearse subtly reshapes neural pathways, strengthening some connections while allowing others to weaken. The brain is not fixed hardware. It is living tissue that reorganizes in response to how it is used. This process begins at birth and never truly stops. Learning a new skill, forming a habit, falling in love, enduring stress, or surviving trauma all alter the brain structure. Neurons that fire together begin to wire together, creating pathways that feel increasingly automatic. Over time, these pathways become the default routes your mind travels, often without conscious choice. Neuroplasticity explains why change feels difficult. The brain is efficient, not wise. It prefers familiar routes, even when they lead to pain. Old patterns require less energy to activate than new ones. This is why people can intellectually understand something, yet feel unable to act differently. The brain has learned one way of responding, and it resists being rewired. At the same time, plasticity is the source of hope. No pattern is permanent. With repetition, attention, and emotional engagement, new pathways can form. Fear responses can soften. Confidence can grow. What once felt impossible can become natural. The brain responds not to intention alone, but to consistent experience. Neuroplasticity also carries a quiet warning. Repeated stress, negativity, or self-criticism does not just affect mood. It trains the brain to expect threat, failure, or rejection. Over time, the mind becomes shaped by what it rehearses most. Your brain is always learning, even when you are not trying to teach it. Every moment is practice for something. Neuroplasticity ensures that what you repeatedly think, feel, and do is not just passing through you. It is slowly becoming you, encoded into the structure of how your mind meets the world. Long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is the neurological process through which repeated experiences physically strengthen the connections between neurons in the brain. When certain neural pathways are activated again and again, the communication between those neurons becomes faster, more efficient, and more likely to occur in the future. In simple terms, what you repeat, your brain reinforces. What fires together, wires together. This process is the foundation of learning, memory, and habit. Each time you revisit a thought, an emotion, or a behavior, you are not just remembering it, you are rebuilding it, making it easier to access next time. The brain does not distinguish between useful repetition and harmful repetition. It strengthens whatever is practiced most, whether that is confidence or self-doubt, calm or fear. Long-term potentiation explains why emotional experiences leave such deep marks. When an event carries strong emotion, the neural firing is intense, and the strengthening effect is powerful. A single moment of humiliation, joy, or terror can carve a lasting pathway that resurfaces automatically years later. The body remembers before the mind understands. This mechanism also explains why change feels difficult. Old pathways are strong because they have been used repeatedly. New ways of thinking feel unnatural because the neural connections are weak and inefficient at first. The brain prefers the path of least resistance, even if that path leads to pain. Familiar reactions feel automatic because they are biologically reinforced. Long-term potentiation shapes identity. The stories you tell yourself, the emotions you return to, and the reactions you rehearse become embedded in neural structure. Over time, they feel like personality rather than patterns. This process is not fast, but it is relentless. Every repeated thought leaves a trace. Every rehearsed emotion deepens a groove. Without awareness, the brain quietly commits you to the past, strengthening yesterday's responses until they feel like who you are today. Encoding specificity. Encoding specificity is the psychological principle that memory is deeply tied to the context in which it is formed. Information is not stored in isolation. When you learn something, your brain encodes not only the content, but also the surrounding environment, emotional state, physical sensations, and internal mood present at that moment. Memory becomes anchored to a specific state of being. This is why recall can feel effortless in one moment and impossible in another. A word, a feeling, or a realization can sit just out of reach, not because it is gone, but because the mind cannot access the conditions under which it was stored. The memory is there, waiting for the right internal key. Encoding specificity explains why certain places flood you with emotion. A familiar street can resurrect an entire version of yourself. A smell can unlock memories you did not know you still carried. The context acts as a trigger, quietly reopening stored experiences without warning. What returns is not just information, but sensation. Emotion plays a powerful role in this process. Memories formed during fear, joy, shame, or love are bound tightly to those states. When a similar emotion arises later, the brain retrieves associated memories automatically. This is why sadness can summon old losses and confidence can revive forgotten strengths. The present emotional state determines which parts of the past become accessible. This mechanism also shapes self-perception. People may believe they have changed when in reality they are simply in a different context that accesses different memories. Skills, confidence, and insight can feel absent when the internal state no longer matches the original encoding conditions. Encoding specificity quietly governs learning, healing, and growth. Change becomes difficult not because knowledge is missing, but because access is restricted. When context shifts, memory hides. When context aligns, memory returns, bringing with it entire emotional worlds that never truly disappeared. State-dependent memory. State-dependent memory is the psychological phenomenon in which recall is shaped by the emotional, mental, or physical state you are in when information was first encoded. Memories are not stored in isolation. They are bound to the internal conditions present at the moment they were formed. When your current state matches the original one, access becomes easier. When it doesn't, memories can feel distant, fragmented, or unreachable. This is why certain memories surface only when you feel a specific way. Sadness unlocks scenes you forgot existed. Confidence brings back moments of strength. Anxiety resurrects old fears with unsettling clarity. The memory was always there, but the key was missing. Your mind remembers best when it feels familiar from the inside. State-dependent memory reveals that remembering is not a neutral act. Emotion is not just attached to memory, it organizes it. Experiences learned in calm states are harder to retrieve in panic. Insights gained in clarity disappear in chaos. Promises made in hope feel foreign in despair. The mind does not store truth alone, it stores context. This mechanism explains why people feel like different versions of themselves in different moods. Each state grants access to a different archive of memories, beliefs, and self-perceptions. In one state, you remember resilience. In another, only failure feels real. The past reshapes itself depending on how the present feels. State-dependent memory also keeps emotional cycles alive. When you enter a familiar state, the memories tied to it rush forward, reinforcing the feeling and making it seem inevitable. The mind confuses accessibility with accuracy. What you can remember feels like all that exists. This process quietly governs learning, healing, and relapse. Without awareness, people judge themselves harshly for forgetting what they once knew. But the knowledge was not lost. It was simply stored in a different state, waiting for the mind to feel its way back. Prospective memory. Prospective memory is the psychological process that allows you to remember to carry out intentions in the future. It is not about recalling the past, but about remembering to remember. It holds the quiet promise of later, the mental note that lingers in the background while life continues to move forward. Call someone tomorrow. Send the message later. Take the medication tonight. The intention is formed now, but its execution waits in time. What makes prospective memory fragile is that it must survive distraction. Unlike memories triggered by reminders from the past, prospective memory depends on the mind recognizing the right moment in the future and pulling the intention forward on its own. Life does not pause to remind you. The brain must interrupt itself. This process is deeply emotional. Forgetting a future intention often carries guilt, shame, or self-blame. You didn't just forget an action, you forgot a responsibility, a promise, a version of yourself you intended to be. Over time, repeated failures of prospective memory can quietly erode trust in your own reliability. Prospective memory is especially vulnerable under stress. When cognitive load is high, the mind prioritizes immediate demands and lets future-oriented intentions fade. Anxiety narrows attention to the present threat. Fatigue dulls the signal that would normally bring the intention back into awareness. This is why overwhelmed people forget even the things they care about most. Emotion can both help and harm this process. Strong emotional importance can strengthen prospective memory, making an intention harder to ignore. At the same time, emotional avoidance can suppress it. The mind may forget tasks that carry discomfort, confrontation, or fear. Prospective memory shapes daily functioning and self-image. It determines whether intentions become actions or remain unrealized plans. Without awareness, missed intentions feel like personal failure rather than cognitive limitation. The mind moves forward, carrying unfinished futures behind it, hoping they will resurface at the right moment before it is too late to act. Source monitoring. Source monitoring is the psychological process through which the mind determines where a memory came from. It is how you decide whether something you remember was something you experienced, something you imagined, something you were told, or something you inferred later. Most of the time, this process feels automatic, seamless, and reliable. In reality, it is fragile and easily distorted. Memories do not come with labels. When a memory surfaces, the mind must reconstruct its origin using clues like emotional intensity, vividness, familiarity, and confidence. If those cues feel strong enough, the memory is accepted as real. If they feel weak, doubt creeps in. This reconstruction happens silently, without conscious checking. Source monitoring explains why people can confidently remember things that never happened or misattribute the origin of an idea. A story heard repeatedly can begin to feel like a personal experience. An imagined scenario can gain emotional texture until it feels lived. Over time, repetition strengthens familiarity, and familiarity becomes mistaken for truth. Emotion plays a powerful role in this confusion. Strong feelings add weight to memories, making them feel more authentic, regardless of accuracy. Stress, fatigue, and distraction weaken the mind's ability to track origins, allowing details to blend together. The brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, choosing a story that feels complete rather than one that is precise. This process shapes identity. Beliefs about the past influence decisions in the present. When the source of a memory is wrong, the emotional conclusions drawn from it still feel real. Regret, pride, shame, and trust can all be built on misattributed experiences. Source monitoring reveals how memory is not a recording, but a construction. What you believe happened is shaped by how your mind pieces together fragments, filling in gaps until a narrative feels solid. Once accepted, that narrative guides emotion and behavior, even if its origins were quietly mistaken. False memory. False memory is the psychological phenomenon in which the mind recalls events that never happened or remembers real events in distorted ways. These memories feel vivid, detailed, and emotionally convincing, often carrying the same certainty as genuine experiences. The unsettling truth is that confidence in a memory is not proof of its accuracy. The mind does not record the past like a camera. It reconstructs it. Memory is rebuilt each time it is recalled. Details are filled in using expectations, emotions, and suggestions, often without awareness. Over time, imagined elements blend seamlessly with real ones. A story retold becomes a memory lived. A suggestion becomes a certainty. What feels personal and undeniable may be a mental construction shaped by repetition and belief. False memory explains why people can argue passionately about what really happened, and both feel completely right. Emotion strengthens memory, but it does not protect it from distortion. In fact, strong emotion makes memories more vulnerable to reshaping. The more a memory matters, the more it is rehearsed, and the more opportunities there are for alteration. This phenomenon also affects identity. People build narratives about who they are based on remembered experiences. If those memories are flawed, the story of the self becomes flawed as well. A childhood slight can grow into a defining wound. A misunderstood moment can become proof of rejection or failure. False memory thrives in trust. When information comes from authority, repetition, or emotional resonance, the mind accepts it easily. Over time, doubt fades. The memory settles in as truth. The danger of false memory is not deception, but sincerity. People act, judge, and feel based on memories they would swear are real. The past becomes a story the mind tells itself, and once believed, it shapes emotion, behavior, and relationships as powerfully as any event that truly occurred. Memory reconstruction. Memory reconstruction is the psychological process through which the mind actively rebuilds memories each time they are recalled, rather than retrieving them as fixed recordings. What you remember is not a preserved snapshot of the past, but a living reconstruction shaped by your current beliefs, emotions, and expectations. Every act of remembering subtly alters what is remembered. When a memory is recalled, it becomes temporarily flexible. Details are filled in, adjusted, emphasized, or softened to fit the story your mind currently tells about itself and the world. The brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy. It reshapes the past so it makes sense in the present. This is why memories can feel vivid and certain while being objectively distorted. Emotion plays a powerful role in this process. Strong feelings act like glue, anchoring some elements while allowing others to shift. Joy can brighten a memory beyond what was felt at the time. Shame can darken neutral moments. Fear can insert danger where none existed. The memory feels authentic because the emotion is real, even if the details are not. Memory reconstruction explains why two people can remember the same event in conflicting ways, each convinced they are correct. Their minds are not lying. They are reconstructing meaning. Over time, repeated recall strengthens the altered version, not the original experience. The revised memory becomes the truth you carry. This process also shapes identity. Personal history is built from reconstructed memories that reinforce who you believe you are. Past failures may grow larger, past successes smaller, depending on self-image. The mind edits its own story to maintain emotional balance, even if it sacrifices precision. Memory reconstruction can protect you, softening painful experiences so you can move forward. But it can also trap you, preserving narratives that no longer serve you. Old wounds may feel fresh because they are repeatedly rebuilt with present pain. The past is never finished. It is continuously rewritten inside the present each time you remember it, quietly reshaping what you believe has already happened. Implicit learning. Implicit learning is the psychological process through which the mind absorbs patterns, rules, and associations without conscious awareness. You learn without realizing you are learning. Knowledge forms quietly beneath attention, shaping behavior long before it becomes something you can explain. This is why you can do things skillfully without knowing how you know. From early childhood, implicit learning is constantly at work. Language patterns, social norms, emotional reactions, and expectations are picked up simply through exposure. No instruction is required. The mind detects regularities, stores them, and begins using them automatically. Over time, these patterns feel natural, obvious, even inevitable. This process explains intuition. When something feels right or wrong without a clear reason, it is often implicit learning speaking. The brain has recognized a pattern it cannot consciously articulate. Experience has been compressed into a feeling. You trust it because it has worked before, even if you cannot trace its origin. Implicit learning is powerful because it bypasses resistance. The mind does not argue with what it does not notice. Beliefs, habits, and emotional responses form without debate. This is why repeated exposure to certain environments, relationships, or emotional climates can shape a person deeply without their consent or awareness. It also explains why change can feel threatening. Implicit knowledge creates automatic responses that keep life predictable. When new information challenges these patterns, discomfort arises. The conscious mind may want change, but the implicit system resists, pulling behavior back toward what feels familiar. This mechanism operates constantly in relationships. You learn how to act around certain people without deciding to. Your body adjusts before your thoughts do. Tone, posture, and emotional distance are shaped by what has been learned silently over time. Implicit learning reveals that much of who you are was never chosen. It was absorbed. Your reactions, preferences, and limits are not only products of thought, but of patterns learned quietly, repeated endlessly, and stored beneath awareness, guiding you long before you believe you have decided anything at all. Observational learning. Observational learning is the psychological process through which behavior is acquired simply by watching others. No direct instruction is required. No personal experience is necessary. The mind absorbs patterns, consequences, and emotional cues from the environment and quietly stores them as potential behavior. Learning happens without effort, often without awareness. From early life, humans are wired to observe before they act. The brain tracks who is rewarded, who is punished, who is admired, and who is ignored. These observations shape expectations about what is safe, acceptable, or dangerous. Long before you choose how to behave, you have already learned what behavior leads to approval or rejection. This process explains why people inherit emotional habits, not just skills. Tone of voice, ways of handling conflict, expressions of affection, and responses to stress are often copied unconsciously. You may swear you will never behave like someone you watched growing up, yet find yourself repeating their patterns when emotion takes over. The lesson was learned long before you had language for it. Observational learning is powerful because it bypasses resistance. The mind does not argue with what it sees repeated. It accepts patterns as reality. When certain behaviors appear normal in your environment, they feel natural to reproduce, even if they are harmful. The brain confuses familiarity with correctness. This mechanism also explains sudden change. Seeing someone similar to you succeed can unlock belief. Watching someone fail can quietly install fear. The observer becomes the participant internally before ever acting outwardly. Observational learning shapes identity, ambition, and self-worth. You learn not only how to act, but what to expect from life and from yourself. Much of who you are was learned by watching others live, long before you realized you were paying attention. Cognitive map. A cognitive map is the mental representation the mind creates to organize space, relationships, and meaning within an environment. It is not just about physical locations, but about how the brain structures understanding of where things belong in relation to one another. Once formed, this internal map allows you to navigate without conscious effort, moving through the world guided by memory rather than constant calculation. This process begins quietly. As you experience a place, a system, or even a relationship, your brain starts connecting points. Paths become familiar. Landmarks gain meaning. Over time, the mind no longer needs direct input to know where it is or what comes next. You feel oriented even when you are not paying attention. The map runs in the background. Cognitive maps extend far beyond geography. You build them for social hierarchies, routines, emotional patterns, and expectations. You learn where safety exists, where conflict usually arises, where approval or rejection tends to appear. These maps guide behavior automatically. You avoid certain paths without knowing why. You gravitate toward others without conscious reasoning. Emotion plays a powerful role in shaping these maps. Places associated with fear feel closer and more urgent. Safe zones feel smaller but comforting. A single intense experience can distort the map, making threats feel omnipresent or exits feel unreachable. The brain adjusts navigation based on emotional weight, not objective distance. Cognitive maps also explain why change can feel disorienting. When familiar structures disappear, the internal map no longer matches reality. Even positive change can create anxiety because the mind has lost its bearings. You may feel lost not because you lack ability, but because your internal guide has not been updated yet. Without awareness, cognitive maps can trap you in outdated routes. You follow the same emotional paths, avoid the same turns, and expect the same outcomes, even when the environment has changed. The mind prefers familiar navigation over exploration, choosing known terrain over uncertainty, even if that terrain keeps leading you back to the same place. Latent learning. Latent learning is the psychological process through which knowledge is acquired without immediate expression or visible change in behavior. Learning happens quietly, without reward, without reinforcement, and often without awareness. Information is stored beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. You do not realize you have learned anything until circumstances demand it. This type of learning challenges the idea that behavior must change for learning to exist. The mind is constantly observing, mapping, and organizing the world, even when there is no obvious reason to do so. Roots, patterns, social dynamics, and unspoken rules are absorbed passively. Nothing seems to happen, yet something is being built internally. Latent learning explains sudden competence. A person can navigate a situation effortlessly the first time they are required to act, surprising even themselves. The knowledge was already there, formed through exposure, not practice. It waited patiently until motivation or necessity unlocked it. Emotion plays a quiet role in this process. The brain often withholds expression until it feels safe or useful. Knowledge learned without pressure feels different from knowledge learned under demand. It is less rigid, more adaptable. This is why insight can arrive suddenly, long after the original experiences occurred. The mind connects stored information only when the context finally aligns. Latent learning also shapes self-trust. People often underestimate themselves because they measure ability only by past action. They forget how much they have absorbed simply by living, watching, and listening. Growth feels invisible until it is suddenly undeniable. This mechanism explains why environments matter deeply. Even when you believe nothing is happening, your mind is recording emotional climates, power structures, and expectations. You are learning how to be, even when you think you are idle. Latent learning reveals that readiness is not always obvious. Preparation can occur in silence. Insight can form without effort. The mind does not waste experience. It stores it, organizes it, and waits. When the moment arrives, what once felt unknown emerges fully formed, not as something new, but as something that had been there all along, unnoticed, patient, and ready to surface. Transfer of learning. Transfer of learning is the psychological process through which past knowledge influences how you approach new situations. What you have already learned does not stay contained within its original context. It moves, shapes, and colors future experiences, often without your awareness. Skills, habits, and expectations travel with you, quietly guiding how you interpret unfamiliar challenges. This process can work in two directions. When past learning aligns with the present, it creates ease. A familiar pattern emerges, confidence rises, and the mind recognizes what to do. When past learning conflicts with the new situation, tension appears. Old rules are applied where they no longer fit, creating frustration or failure. The mind reaches for what it knows, even when it is wrong. Transfer of learning explains why some people adapt quickly while others feel stuck. The difference is not intelligence, but flexibility. When learning is understood deeply rather than memorized rigidly, it transfers more easily. When it is tied to a single context or emotional state, it resists movement. This phenomenon also shapes emotional reactions. Past successes can create courage. Past failures can inject fear into unrelated situations. The mind does not separate lessons neatly, it generalizes. A single, humiliating experience can spill into new environments, altering behavior long after the original threat is gone. Transfer of learning is responsible for both growth and limitation. It allows wisdom to accumulate, but it also allows outdated beliefs to persist. People often think they are responding to the present, when in reality they are responding to echoes of past learning. Without awareness, this process quietly decides what feels possible and what feels forbidden. The mind brings its old maps into new territory, trusting them by default. Whether they guide or mislead depends on whether the past is allowed to update itself in the present. Overlearning. Overlearning is the psychological process that occurs when something is practiced beyond the point of initial mastery until the response becomes automatic. It is what happens when repetition continues even after understanding feels complete. At this stage, the mind no longer needs effort or conscious attention to perform the task. The behavior runs on its own. This process is powerful because it embeds responses deeply into the nervous system. Actions, thoughts, or emotional reactions that are overlearned do not wait for decision. They activate instantly. This can be protective, allowing quick reactions under stress, but it can also quietly imprison behavior. What has been overlearned resists change. Overlearning explains why certain habits feel unbreakable. Repeated reactions to similar situations carve deep neural grooves. The mind defaults to these patterns even when they are no longer useful. Old coping strategies, once necessary, continue to activate long after the original threat has passed. The body responds before awareness arrives. Emotion accelerates overlearning. Experiences repeated under strong emotional charge strengthen faster and last longer. Repeated fear teaches the body to flinch before danger is confirmed. Repeated criticism teaches the mind to anticipate failure. Over time, these reactions feel like instinct rather than learned behavior. This process also shapes identity. Overlearned responses blur into personality traits. Someone who repeatedly suppresses emotion begins to feel emotionally distant by nature. Someone who constantly adapts to others begins to feel invisible. The repetition disappears, leaving only the result. Overlearning is efficient but unforgiving. It does not ask whether the pattern is healthy, only whether it has been practiced. Changing an overlearned response requires not just insight, but sustained interruption. The brain must be shown repeatedly that a different response is possible. Until then, the old pattern continues, not because it is chosen, but because it has been rehearsed too well to stop on its own. Drive reduction. Drive reduction is the psychological principle that behavior is motivated by the desire to reduce internal discomfort. At its core, it is the mind's attempt to restore balance when something feels wrong inside the body or psyche. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, tension, anxiety, and emotional unease all create internal pressure. Action becomes a way to quiet that pressure. This mechanism operates constantly, often beneath awareness. When a drive is activated, it narrows attention and shapes priorities. The mind becomes less interested in long-term outcomes and more focused on immediate relief. Comfort becomes the goal, not growth. The urge to eat, sleep, withdraw, distract, or soothe rises not because the action is meaningful, but because it promises to reduce discomfort. Drive reduction explains why people repeat behaviors they know are harmful. If a habit reliably lowers internal tension, the brain learns to favor it. The relief does not have to last. Even temporary reduction is enough to reinforce the behavior. Over time, the mind links discomfort with a specific response, creating automatic patterns that feel necessary rather than chosen. This process extends beyond physical needs into emotional life. Loneliness creates a drive for connection. Shame creates a drive to hide. Fear creates a drive to escape. Anger creates a drive to discharge tension. The action taken may not resolve the underlying cause, but it quiets the sensation enough to feel like relief. Drive reduction also shapes avoidance. When a situation triggers discomfort, the mind learns to stay away from it. Avoidance reduces anxiety in the short term, teaching the brain that escape works. Each time this happens, tolerance for discomfort shrinks, and the drive becomes more powerful. This system evolved to protect survival, but in modern life, it often clashes with long-term well-being. Growth requires tolerating discomfort, yet the brain is wired to eliminate it. Drive reduction quietly pulls behavior toward relief rather than meaning, soothing rather than change, silence rather than confrontation, shaping lives around what feels easiest to endure rather than what leads forward. Incentive theory. Incentive theory is the psychological explanation for why behavior is pulled forward by the promise of reward or the avoidance of loss. Rather than being driven only by internal needs, people are constantly guided by external signals that suggest pleasure, safety, approval, or relief. These incentives quietly shape choices, attention, and effort, often without conscious calculation. The mind is highly responsive to cues that signal potential gain. Money, praise, recognition, status, and comfort all activate motivational systems that push behavior into motion. When an incentive is present, action feels purposeful. When it disappears, motivation often collapses. This is why effort can feel effortless when reward is visible and exhausting when it is not. Incentive theory also reveals how easily motivation can be manipulated. Environments are designed to trigger desire and compliance. Notifications, deadlines, scores, and social approval function as psychological magnets, pulling behavior in predictable directions. The brain learns to chase what is reinforced, even if the reward is shallow or short-lived. This process affects identity more than people realize. Over time, repeated incentives train the mind to associate worth with outcome. Productivity becomes tied to praise. Belonging becomes tied to approval. The absence of reward begins to feel like failure, even when effort remains. Incentives do not only motivate action, they shape perception. What is rewarded feels important. What is ignored fades. The mind adjusts priorities based on what the environment reinforces, not necessarily on what truly matters. Incentive theory also explains burnout. When rewards become inconsistent or hollow, motivation decays. The nervous system resists effort without meaning. Without awareness, people confuse loss of incentive with loss of ability. Behavior follows what is reinforced. The mind moves toward what promises relief or recognition, often long before values or long-term consequences are considered. Intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the psychological drive to engage in an activity for its own sake, not because of external rewards or pressure, but because the action itself feels meaningful, satisfying, or alive. When intrinsic motivation is present, effort does not feel forced. Attention narrows naturally. Time softens. The reward is embedded in the experience of doing. This form of motivation arises when actions align with internal values, curiosity, or a sense of personal agency. The mind is not chasing approval, status, or outcomes. It is responding to interest and inner resonance. This is why intrinsically motivated behavior often feels deeply absorbing and emotionally nourishing, even when it is difficult. Intrinsic motivation is fragile. It thrives on autonomy and is easily disrupted by control, surveillance, or excessive evaluation. When an activity becomes overly measured, rewarded, or judged, the internal drive can quietly erode. What once felt chosen begins to feel imposed. The mind shifts from engagement to performance. Emotion plays a central role in sustaining this drive. Joy, curiosity, and personal meaning strengthen intrinsic motivation, while shame, pressure, or fear weaken it. When motivation comes from within, failure does not feel like a threat to identity, it feels like information. When motivation becomes external, failure feels personal and heavy. Intrinsic motivation also shapes long-term persistence. People continue behaviors they are internally drawn to even without recognition. The effort feels worthwhile because it affirms a sense of self. This is why creative work, learning, and personal growth flourish most when driven internally rather than demanded from outside. Without awareness, intrinsic motivation can be slowly replaced by external incentives. The mind learns to wait for permission, praise, or payoff. Over time, people forget what they once did simply because it felt right. The loss is subtle but profound. When intrinsic motivation fades, effort remains, but vitality disappears, leaving action without joy and achievement without fulfillment. Extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is the psychological force that drives behavior through external rewards and consequences rather than internal desire. Action is fueled by what comes afterward: praise, approval, money, grades, status, avoidance of punishment, or fear of loss. The behavior itself may feel neutral or even unpleasant, but the outcome gives it meaning. This form of motivation is powerful because it taps into social survival. From an early age, humans learn that acceptance, safety, and success are often conditional. You are rewarded for doing the right thing, discouraged for doing the wrong one. Over time, the mind begins to associate worth with outcomes. Effort becomes transactional. You act not because you want to, but because something is at stake. Extrinsic motivation shapes much of adult life. Work, performance, productivity, and even relationships can become driven by external validation. The anticipation of reward activates focus and persistence, but it also narrows attention. The mind becomes less curious and more strategic, asking not, "Is this meaningful?" but "Will this pay off?" Emotionally, this creates tension. When motivation comes from outside, control feels fragile. If the reward disappears, so does the drive. People can feel empty, directionless, or anxious when external validation is removed. The behavior may continue, but the sense of purpose weakens. Extrinsic motivation can also crowd out internal signals. When rewards dominate, intrinsic interest fades. Enjoyment becomes secondary to performance. Over time, the mind learns to silence its own preferences in favor of what is rewarded, praised, or expected. This mechanism explains burnout. When effort is sustained only by pressure and payoff, the nervous system remains in a state of striving. Relief is always delayed, contingent on the next result. The self becomes measured, evaluated, and compared, living under the weight of outcomes rather than connection to the act itself. Extrinsic motivation is not inherently harmful. It organizes behavior and enables structure. But when it becomes the primary source of drive, it quietly teaches the mind that value exists outside the self. Action becomes obedience to incentives rather than expression of meaning, and identity slowly reshapes itself around what earns approval instead of what feels true. Delay of gratification. Delay of gratification is the psychological capacity to resist an immediate reward in favor of a more valuable outcome later. It is not simply about willpower, it is about how the mind relates to time, desire, and trust. When faced with a tempting option now versus a better one later, the brain must hold the future as emotionally real, not just logically possible. This ability develops early and shapes the trajectory of a life. The mind weighs certainty against uncertainty. Immediate rewards are concrete, vivid, and guaranteed. Future rewards are abstract, distant, and fragile. To delay gratification, the brain must believe that waiting will be worth it. Without that belief, impulse feels safer than patience. Delay of gratification is deeply tied to emotional regulation. When discomfort rises, the urge to relieve it immediately intensifies. Food, distraction, validation, and escape become powerful. Choosing to wait requires tolerating unease without collapsing into action. This is why stress, fatigue, and fear weaken self-control. The nervous system seeks relief, not wisdom. This process also reveals how people learn to trust the world. When effort is repeatedly rewarded, patience strengthens. When promises are broken, the future feels unreliable. In those conditions, taking what is available now becomes adaptive, not flawed. Delay of gratification influences relationships, learning, health, and achievement. It determines whether short-term comfort overrides long-term well-being. But it is not a moral trait. It is a skill shaped by experience, environment, and belief. The mind does not struggle because it is weak. It struggles because the present speaks louder than the future. To wait is to believe that something unseen is worth holding space for, and that belief must be learned before it can be practiced. Affective forecasting. Affective forecasting is the psychological process through which the mind predicts how future events will make you feel. You constantly simulate emotional futures, imagining the joy of success, the relief of resolution, or the pain of loss long before anything actually happens. These predictions quietly guide decisions, goals, and avoidance, shaping behavior in the present. The problem is not that the mind forecasts emotions, but that it does so inaccurately. People consistently overestimate the intensity and duration of future feelings. Happiness is imagined as permanent. Disappointment is imagined as devastating and endless. The mind forgets its own adaptability. It underestimates how quickly emotions fade, shift, and make room for something else. This bias explains why people chase outcomes they believe will finally complete them, and why they avoid situations they believe will emotionally destroy them. The imagined future carries more emotional weight than the real one ever will. Anticipated joy becomes motivation. Anticipated pain becomes paralysis. Emotion distorts these predictions. When you are anxious, future discomfort feels unbearable. When you are excited, future satisfaction feels guaranteed. The present emotional state bleeds into the imagined future, coloring it with certainty. The mind assumes tomorrow will feel like today, only stronger. Affective forecasting also shapes regret. When outcomes fail to deliver the expected emotional payoff, people feel confused or disappointed in themselves. They assume they chose wrong, rather than recognizing the prediction itself was flawed. The goal was never as emotionally powerful as imagined. This process keeps people suspended between hope and fear, chasing emotional states that are always slightly out of reach. The mind continues to simulate, revise, and project, convinced that the next achievement, the next decision, or the next escape will finally feel the way it is supposed to feel. Meanwhile, the present moment is experienced through the shadow of emotions that have not yet arrived and may never feel the way they were promised. Hedonic adaptation. Hedonic adaptation is the psychological process through which emotional highs and lows gradually lose their intensity as the mind adjusts to new circumstances. What once felt thrilling, devastating, or life-changing slowly becomes ordinary. The nervous system recalibrates, returning emotional experience toward a familiar baseline, regardless of whether life improves or worsens. This process is why major events rarely feel as permanent as they seem in the moment. Achievements that once felt euphoric fade into routine. Losses that once felt unbearable soften with time. The mind is designed to adapt, not to remain in extremes. Emotional intensity demands energy, and the brain constantly seeks equilibrium. Hedonic adaptation explains why satisfaction is so fleeting. Desire is fueled by contrast. When something is new, it stands out against what came before. Once it becomes familiar, it blends into the background of experience. Pleasure does not disappear because it failed, but because it became expected. What was once more becomes normal. This mechanism drives endless striving. When adaptation erases the emotional payoff of success, the mind searches for the next upgrade, the next goal, the next change that promises feeling again. The problem is not lack of achievement, but the brain's ability to normalize it. Contentment becomes unstable because familiarity dulls emotional reward. Hedonic adaptation also applies to suffering. Chronic stress, dissatisfaction, or emotional neglect can become invisible over time. The nervous system adjusts downward, accepting reduced well-being as baseline. People stop noticing how much they are enduring because endurance has become normal. This process shapes identity and expectation. People assume happiness lies just beyond the next change, not realizing the mind will adapt again. The emotional finish line keeps moving. Without awareness, life becomes a cycle of anticipation and adjustment, desire and dulling. Hedonic adaptation is neither cruel nor kind. It is efficient. It protects emotional stability, but it also makes lasting satisfaction elusive. It ensures that no feeling stays loud for long, quietly teaching the mind that intensity is temporary, familiarity is inevitable, and chasing emotional permanence through external change will always end where it began, at a baseline shaped not by circumstance, but by adaptation itself. Set point theory. Set point theory is the psychological idea that each person has a baseline level of emotional well-being that the mind continually returns to, regardless of external changes. Life events may push happiness or distress upward or downward for a time, but the internal system slowly pulls experience back toward a familiar emotional range. What feels like change often turns out to be temporary. This mechanism operates quietly, stabilizing emotional life. After success, excitement fades. After loss, pain softens. The nervous system adjusts, recalibrating what feels normal. This is not because events lack meaning, but because the mind adapts in order to maintain equilibrium. Constant emotional extremes would be unsustainable. Set point theory explains why people are surprised when achievements do not permanently transform how they feel. The promotion, the relationship, the milestone all create a surge, but the emotional system eventually settles. The mind grows accustomed to improved conditions just as it adapts to hardship. This process can be comforting or discouraging. It suggests resilience, but it also suggests limitation. People may chase new goals believing happiness lies just ahead, only to find themselves emotionally where they started. Without understanding this mechanism, disappointment feels personal rather than structural. Set point theory also shapes identity. When emotional states return to baseline, people assume nothing has changed. Growth that occurs beneath awareness is dismissed. At the same time, persistent distress can feel inescapable, as if it defines who you are. The theory does not imply emotional fate, but it highlights inertia. Long-term change requires altering the conditions that feed the baseline itself, not just adding temporary highs. Without awareness, the mind confuses momentary relief with transformation, returning again and again to what feels familiar, mistaking emotional stability for permanence. Emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is the psychological process through which the mind influences which emotions arise, how intensely they are felt, and how long they remain. It is not about suppressing emotion, but about managing the internal response so feelings do not overwhelm behavior, identity, or perception. This process operates constantly, often without conscious awareness, shaping how you move through everyday life. From early experiences, people learn strategies for handling emotion. Some learn to soothe themselves, others learn to distract, intellectualize, numb, or hide what they feel. These strategies form long before they are named. Over time, they become automatic responses to discomfort, activating the moment an emotion threatens to exceed tolerance. Emotional regulation is deeply tied to safety. When emotions feel dangerous or unacceptable, the mind intervenes quickly. Anger may be swallowed before it reaches awareness. Sadness may turn into fatigue. Fear may transform into control. The goal is not emotional truth, but stability. The nervous system seeks equilibrium, even if that equilibrium is emotionally constricted. This process affects relationships in subtle ways. Poor regulation can lead to emotional flooding, where feelings spill out faster than they can be understood. Overregulation can create emotional distance, making connection feel muted or hollow. Others may sense calm on the surface, while intensity builds underneath, unmanaged and unexpressed. Stress places heavy demand on emotional regulation. When resources are depleted, the system falters. Emotions emerge raw, intense, and difficult to contain. What once felt manageable suddenly feels unbearable, not because the emotion changed, but because the capacity to regulate it has been exhausted. Emotional regulation also shapes self-image. People often judge themselves not for what they feel, but for how well they believe they should be controlling it. Shame attaches to emotion rather than behavior. Without awareness, regulation becomes rigid, prioritizing control over understanding. The mind works endlessly to keep emotions within acceptable limits, even when those limits were learned in moments that no longer exist. Alexithymia. Alexithymia is a psychological condition characterized by difficulty identifying, understanding, and describing one's own emotions. Feelings are present, but they arrive without clear labels. Sensations exist in the body: tightness, fatigue, restlessness, pressure, but the emotional meaning behind them remains blurred or inaccessible. The inner world feels quiet, confusing, or distant rather than expressive. This does not mean emotions are absent. In many cases, they are intense but unrecognized. The mind experiences emotional signals without translating them into conscious awareness. Instead of sadness, there is heaviness. Instead of anger, there is tension. Instead of fear, there is agitation. The body reacts, but the emotional language never forms. Alexithymia often develops as a protective adaptation. In environments where emotions were dismissed, punished, or overwhelming, the mind learned to disconnect from emotional awareness. Naming feelings became unsafe or unnecessary. Over time, this disconnection hardened into habit. What began as survival became structure. This condition affects relationships deeply. When emotions cannot be identified, they cannot be communicated. Others may perceive emotional distance, indifference, or coldness, even when care is present. The individual may feel misunderstood without knowing why, sensing a gap between themselves and others that is difficult to bridge. Internally, Alexithymia can create confusion and stress. Without emotional clarity, decisions rely heavily on logic or external cues. Needs go unmet because they are never recognized. Emotional buildup can express itself physically through fatigue, headaches, or unexplained discomfort. Alexithymia also limits self-regulation. Emotions that cannot be named cannot be processed. They linger in the nervous system, unresolved and unexamined. Over time, this can lead to emotional overload, sudden outbursts, or complete withdrawal. This condition is not a lack of depth, but a lack of translation. The emotional world exists, but it speaks in a language the conscious mind was never taught to understand. Emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is the psychological process through which emotions spread from one person to another without words, intention, or conscious choice. Moods pass quietly through tone, facial expression, posture, and rhythm. Before logic engages, the nervous system has already responded. You feel something shift inside you and assume it came from within, unaware that it may have been borrowed. Humans are wired for this transmission. The brain automatically mirrors emotional cues as a way to understand and predict others. This mirroring happens instantly. A tense room creates unease. Laughter loosens the body. Anxiety sharpens attention. The emotion enters before it is recognized. Emotional contagion explains why environments shape inner experience so powerfully. Prolonged exposure to stress, cynicism, or fear can quietly recalibrate what feels normal. Over time, borrowed emotions become internalized, blurring the line between what is felt and what is absorbed. People begin carrying emotional states that were never originally theirs. This phenomenon is strongest when awareness is low. Fatigue, distraction, and vulnerability increase susceptibility. In close relationships, emotional contagion intensifies. Partners, families, and teams synchronize moods, often without realizing it. One person's unresolved emotion can quietly set the tone for everyone else. Emotional contagion also plays a role in motivation and belief. Hope spreads just as easily as despair. Confidence can lift others into action. Fear can freeze an entire group. This is why leadership is as emotional as it is rational. The danger lies in unconscious adoption. When emotions are absorbed without recognition, people react as if the feeling is self-generated. Boundaries dissolve. Emotional autonomy weakens. Without awareness, the mind becomes a receiver, constantly tuned to the emotional frequencies around it, mistaking resonance for truth and absorption for authenticity. Mood congruence. Mood congruence is the psychological tendency for current emotional states to shape what thoughts, memories, and interpretations become most accessible. When you are in a particular mood, your mind naturally selects information that matches it. Sadness pulls sad memories forward. Anxiety highlights threat. Joy brings ease and possibility into focus. The mind does not search evenly. It searches in alignment with how it already feels. This process creates the illusion that your mood is justified by reality. When you feel low, the past appears filled with failure and loss. When you feel hopeful, the same past seems more forgiving. Nothing external has changed, yet everything feels different. Mood congruence quietly edits perception, reinforcing the emotion already present. Memory is especially vulnerable to this effect. Emotional states act like filters, allowing certain memories through while blocking others. In a negative mood, positive experiences feel distant or unreal. In a positive mood, struggles feel manageable or temporary. The mind builds a narrative that supports the emotional tone of the moment. Mood congruence also affects judgment. Decisions made in strong emotional states tend to favor interpretations that match the mood. Fear leads to avoidance. Anger leads to blame. Contentment leads to trust. These choices feel logical at the time because the information supporting them is most available. This mechanism can trap people in emotional loops. A low mood retrieves painful memories, which deepen the mood, which retrieve more pain. Over time, the mind begins to believe this narrowed view is the full truth. Emotional states become self-reinforcing. Mood congruence is not deliberate. It is an efficiency shortcut. The brain assumes that current emotion reflects current reality. Without awareness, this assumption hardens. Temporary feelings begin to define identity and expectation. What you feel now becomes what you believe has always been true, even when it is only the echo of a passing state coloring the mind. Personality trait. A personality trait is a stable pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving that shapes how a person moves through the world. It is not a single action, but a tendency that repeats across situations, quietly influencing reactions, choices, and relationships. Traits give consistency to identity, making behavior feel predictable both to others and to the self. These patterns form gradually, shaped by genetics, early environment, emotional learning, and repeated experience. Over time, the brain reinforces familiar responses. What begins as a reaction becomes a habit. What becomes a habit solidifies into a trait. The mind learns what feels safe, effective, or rewarded, and returns to those strategies automatically. Personality traits feel personal and intentional, but they often operate beneath awareness. Someone may describe themselves as cautious, intense, agreeable, or distant without realizing how these patterns were shaped. Traits are not chosen, they are learned solutions to earlier conditions. They once worked, so the mind kept them. This stability provides comfort. Traits reduce uncertainty by offering a consistent way to respond, but the same stability can become limiting. A trait that once protected can later restrict growth. Emotional guardedness can prevent intimacy. Excessive conscientiousness can become anxiety. Assertiveness can harden into control. The mind continues using familiar tools even when circumstances change. Traits also shape how others respond to you, creating feedback loops. Reactions from the world reinforce the trait, making it feel even more true. Over time, identity and behavior blur. You stop noticing the pattern because it feels like who you are. Personality traits influence self-judgment as well. People confuse traits with fixed truth, believing change is unnatural or impossible. But traits are tendencies, not destinies. They persist because they are practiced, not because they are permanent. Every trait carries both strength and cost. The same pattern that creates success in one context can create suffering in another. Traits are not flaws or virtues on their own. They are strategies the mind learned early and repeats faithfully, shaping life quietly, consistently, and often invisibly, long before conscious choice ever enters the picture. Trait stability. Trait stability is the psychological concept that personality traits tend to remain relatively consistent over time, even as circumstances, roles, and environments change. Beneath shifting moods and behaviors, there are enduring patterns in how a person thinks, feels, and responds to the world. These patterns create a sense of continuity, making someone recognizable to themselves and to others across years. This stability forms early. Temperament, emotional reactivity, and habitual ways of interpreting experience begin shaping personality long before conscious choice is possible. Over time, these tendencies become reinforced through repetition. The mind gravitates toward familiar reactions, strengthening the traits that feel most natural. Change happens. but it tends to orbit a stable core. Trait stability explains why people often feel pulled back into old versions of themselves. Even after growth, insight, or intention, stress can reactivate familiar responses. Patience shrinks, anxiety rises, avoidance returns. The nervous system defaults to well-worn patterns because they require less effort than novelty. This consistency provides predictability, but it can also feel limiting. People may believe they are incapable of change when they notice the same tendencies resurfacing. They confuse persistence with permanence. Trait stability does not mean traits are unchangeable. It means they resist sudden transformation. Relationships are shaped by this force. Expectations form based on observed traits, and people are treated accordingly. Over time, those expectations reinforce the traits themselves, creating self-fulfilling loops. A person labeled as distant becomes more distant. A person seen as capable is given more opportunity to act that way. Trait stability gives identity its shape. It provides coherence, but it can also anchor old stories about who someone is allowed to be. Without awareness, people mistake familiar patterns for fixed truths, living inside traits that once helped them survive but may no longer serve who they are becoming. Situationism. Situationism is the psychological concept that human behavior is shaped less by stable personality traits and more by the immediate situation a person is in. It challenges the comforting belief that people act the way they do because of who they are. Instead, it reveals how powerfully context, pressure, roles, and environment can override character, intention, and moral identity. This idea is unsettling because it removes the illusion of personal certainty. People like to believe they would act kindly, courageously, or ethically, regardless of circumstances. Situationism suggests otherwise. When situations shift, behavior often shifts with them. Authority, urgency, fear, anonymity, or social pressure can pull actions out of people that feel shocking in hindsight. Situationism explains why ordinary individuals can behave in ways they later cannot recognize. The situation narrows attention, alters emotional thresholds, and changes what feels permissible. Actions taken under pressure feel justified in the moment, even when they conflict with personal values. The environment whispers instructions, and the mind listens. This process also shapes judgment of others. When observing behavior, people instinctively attribute actions to personality rather than context. Someone is labeled cruel, lazy, or weak, while the situational forces shaping their behavior are ignored. This creates moral distance and false certainty. Emotion plays a central role. Stress compresses decision-making. Fear accelerates compliance. Belonging silences doubt. The stronger the situation, the quieter the internal voice becomes. Awareness narrows until alternatives disappear. Situationism does not deny responsibility, but it complicates it. It suggests that character is not tested in isolation, but under pressure. Without awareness of situational influence, people overestimate their own moral stability and underestimate their vulnerability to context. The most disturbing implication is how easily behavior can change when the situation is engineered. When environments reward obedience, speed, or silence, people adapt. The mind learns what is required to survive the moment. Later, when the situation dissolves, the behavior remains, leaving individuals to wonder how something so out of character ever felt so natural at the time. Locus of control. Locus of control is the psychological belief about where power over life events truly resides. It reflects whether a person experiences outcomes as the result of their own actions or as forces imposed from the outside. This belief operates quietly, shaping motivation, responsibility, and emotional response long before conscious reasoning steps in. When the locus of control is internal, the mind interprets success and failure as connected to effort, choice, and ability. Actions feel meaningful because they are believed to influence results. Confidence grows not from certainty of success, but from the belief that behavior matters. Even setbacks feel tolerable because they can be integrated into learning. When the locus of control is external, outcomes feel governed by luck, fate, authority, or uncontrollable circumstances. Effort feels less rewarding because it does not reliably change results. Over time, this belief can erode motivation. Why try if outcomes feel predetermined or random? The emotional cost is subtle but heavy, often showing up as resignation or quiet frustration. This belief is shaped early. Repeated experiences of unpredictability, punishment without explanation, or effort without reward teach the mind that control is unreliable. The brain adapts by lowering expectation. This can protect against disappointment, but it also limits engagement with life. Locus of control deeply affects stress. When challenges arise, those with an internal orientation focus on response, while those with an external orientation focus on threat. One feels agency, the other feels exposure. Neither belief guarantees accuracy, but each determines emotional tone. This concept also influences relationships. People with different loci of control interpret the same situation differently. One sees miscommunication as fixable. The other sees it as inevitable. Over time, these interpretations shape behavior, reinforcing the belief itself. Locus of control is not about denying reality or claiming total power. It is about perceived influence. The mind does not need absolute control to feel engaged. It needs to believe that actions matter. When that belief fades, effort collapses inward, and life begins to feel like something that happens to you rather than something you participate in shaping. Self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the psychological belief in your own ability to influence outcomes through your actions. It is not about skill alone, but about conviction. Two people with the same ability can perform very differently depending on whether they believe their effort will matter. This belief quietly determines how much you try, how long you persist, and how you respond to failure. When self-efficacy is high, challenges feel engaging rather than threatening. Effort feels justified because the mind expects impact. Obstacles are interpreted as problems to solve, not signals to stop. When self-efficacy is low, the same challenges feel heavy and personal. Difficulty becomes evidence of inadequacy. The mind withdraws before action has a chance to work. This belief forms through experience. Success strengthens it, failure weakens it, but interpretation matters more than outcome. When setbacks are seen as temporary or specific, self-efficacy survives. When they are seen as proof of personal limitation, belief collapses. Over time, the mind learns whether effort feels safe or pointless. Self-efficacy shapes emotional life. People who believe they can cope experience less anxiety in uncertainty. Those who doubt their influence feel overwhelmed more quickly. Helplessness is not just about circumstance, it is about perceived control. When the mind believes nothing it does will matter, motivation drains away. This process also affects learning and growth. Low self-efficacy leads to avoidance, which prevents new evidence from forming. The belief protects itself by limiting exposure to challenge. High self-efficacy encourages engagement, creating more opportunities for mastery and reinforcement. Self-efficacy is not confidence in outcomes, but trust in response. It is the quiet sense that even if things go wrong, you can act, adjust, and endure. Without it, potential remains unused. With it, effort becomes meaningful. The mind does not ask whether success is guaranteed. It asks whether action is worth taking, and that belief shapes everything that follows. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the psychological state that develops when a person repeatedly experiences situations where their actions have no effect on outcomes. Over time, the mind stops trying. Effort feels pointless. Initiative fades. Even when control becomes possible again, the belief that nothing will change remains deeply embedded. This process begins quietly. Failed attempts, ignored needs, or unpredictable punishment teach the nervous system that agency is dangerous or useless. The mind learns that effort does not lead to relief, only exhaustion. Eventually, the absence of action feels safer than the risk of hope. Emotion plays a powerful role in this conditioning. Repeated disappointment creates emotional numbness. Motivation drains not because desire disappears, but because expectation collapses. The future feels closed, not because it truly is, but because the mind no longer trusts itself to influence it. Learned helplessness reshapes perception. Opportunities go unnoticed. Solutions feel irrelevant. Encouragement feels hollow. When change is suggested, it feels insulting rather than empowering. The mind interprets possibility as threat because it contradicts everything experience has taught it. This state affects identity. People stop describing themselves as unlucky and begin describing themselves as incapable. Helplessness becomes internalized, transforming external failure into personal defect. Shame replaces curiosity. Withdrawal replaces experimentation. Learned helplessness also spreads. It influences relationships, work, and health. People tolerate harmful environments because leaving feels impossible. They stop advocating for themselves because past efforts taught them it wouldn't matter. Even small choices feel heavy. What makes learned helplessness so enduring is that it persists after conditions improve. Freedom arrives, but the mind does not recognize it. The internal rule remains. Nothing I do matters. Without awareness, this belief silently governs behavior, turning potential into paralysis and possibility into something that feels unreachable even when it is already within reach. Attribution theory. Attribution theory explains how the mind assigns causes to behavior and events. When something happens, the brain immediately searches for an explanation, not to be accurate, but to make the world feel understandable. This process happens automatically, shaping emotion, judgment, and reaction before conscious reflection ever begins. The mind tends to ask a simple question: was this caused by the person or by the situation? From that answer, meaning unfolds. If behavior is attributed to character, it feels stable and personal. If it is attributed to circumstance, it feels temporary and external. This distinction quietly determines how much blame, empathy, or forgiveness is applied. Attribution theory explains why misunderstandings are so persistent. People interpret their own behavior through context and necessity, while interpreting others through personality and intent. A personal mistake feels situational. Someone else's mistake feels revealing. The same action carries different meaning depending on whose behavior it is. Emotion intensifies attribution. When anger is present, the mind leans toward blame. When fear is present, it leans toward threat. When attachment is present, it leans toward excuse. The brain protects emotional coherence by choosing explanations that fit how it already feels. This process shapes identity as well. Repeated attributions about success and failure accumulate into beliefs about competence and worth. If success is attributed to luck and failure to self, confidence erodes. If failure is attributed to circumstance and success to effort, resilience grows. These interpretations feel like truth, but they are habits of explanation. Attribution theory also influences relationships deeply. The stories people tell themselves about each other determine closeness or distance. A missed message can mean disinterest or distraction. A raised voice can mean hostility or stress. The chosen explanation becomes the emotional reality. Attribution is not about what happened, it is about why the mind believes it happened. That belief shapes response, memory, and expectation, quietly guiding behavior long after the original event has passed, and reinforcing the lens through which future events will be interpreted again and again. Fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error is the psychological tendency to explain other people's behavior as a reflection of who they are, while explaining your own behavior as a response to circumstances. When someone else fails, the mind reaches for character. When you fail, it reaches for context. This imbalance happens automatically, shaping judgment before reflection has a chance to intervene. The brain prefers simple explanations. Attributing behavior to personality feels efficient and emotionally satisfying. It creates clarity and distance. If someone is late, they are careless. If they are rude, they are selfish. The complexity of their situation disappears. In contrast, when judging yourself, the mind zooms outward. Stress, pressure, misunderstanding, and bad timing become central. This bias feels invisible because it aligns with emotional self-protection. Seeing yourself as situational preserves self-worth. Seeing others as dispositional preserves a sense of predictability and control. The world feels easier to navigate when people seem consistent and explainable. Fundamental attribution error quietly damages relationships. Misunderstandings harden into labels. One mistake becomes a trait. Over time, empathy erodes because context is no longer considered. People react not to behavior, but to the story they have constructed about the person behind it. This error also fuels conflict and division. Groups explain their own actions as necessary and justified, while viewing opposing groups as inherently flawed. Moral certainty grows, curiosity fades. The mind stops asking what pressures or limitations shaped the behavior. Fundamental attribution error is powerful because it feels like common sense. It rarely announces itself as bias. Without awareness, people believe they are seeing clearly when they are actually simplifying human complexity. The danger is not misjudgment alone, but the confidence with which it is held. Once a trait is assigned, evidence is filtered to support it, and understanding becomes the first casualty. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the psychological tendency to interpret events in a way that protects self-esteem and preserves a positive self-image. Success is credited to personal ability, intelligence, or effort, while failure is attributed to external forces like bad luck, unfair treatment, or circumstances beyond control. This bias operates automatically, shaping how people explain outcomes to themselves long before logic intervenes. At its core, self-serving bias acts as an emotional shield. The mind resists information that threatens identity. When something goes right, it reinforces a sense of competence and worth. When something goes wrong, blame is quietly redirected outward to avoid internal damage. This protects confidence, but it also distorts self-awareness. Emotion fuels this process. Pride strengthens memory for success. Shame weakens memory for responsibility. The mind selectively highlights evidence that confirms competence while softening or erasing evidence of limitation. Over time, this creates a narrative where personal strengths feel stable and obvious, while mistakes feel situational and temporary. Self-serving bias shapes relationships in subtle ways. Conflicts are remembered unevenly. One's own intentions feel clear and reasonable, while others' actions feel flawed or unfair. Accountability becomes emotionally threatening because it challenges the protected self-image. Apologies feel heavier than defenses because they require the bias to loosen its grip. This mechanism also affects growth. When failure is externalized too consistently, learning stalls. Patterns repeat because causes are never fully examined. The mind avoids discomfort at the cost of insight. Improvement requires confronting personal contribution, which self-serving bias instinctively resists. At the same time, this bias is not purely harmful. It helps people recover from setbacks, maintain motivation, and survive emotionally difficult periods. Without it, self-criticism could become overwhelming. The danger arises when protection turns into denial. Without awareness, self-serving bias quietly rewrites experience. It edits memory, reshapes responsibility, and reinforces identity. You come to believe not only that you tried your best, but that outcomes were never truly in your hands to begin with. Over time, this belief feels comforting, even as it subtly limits change. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological tension that arises when a person holds conflicting beliefs, values, or behaviors at the same time. The mind craves internal consistency. When actions contradict self-image or beliefs clash with evidence, discomfort emerges. This discomfort is not logical or deliberate. It is visceral, emotional, and deeply motivating. Rather than changing behavior, the mind often changes meaning. To reduce dissonance, people reinterpret events, justify actions, or alter beliefs in subtle ways. The goal is not truth, but relief. The brain will work tirelessly to restore harmony, even if it requires distorting reality. This process explains why people defend choices that hurt them. Once a decision is made, especially one involving sacrifice, the mind increases its perceived value. Admitting a mistake threatens identity. Rationalization feels safer than regret. The more effort invested, the stronger the justification becomes. Cognitive dissonance also shapes belief systems. When confronted with information that challenges core values, the mind resists. Evidence is dismissed, sources are discredited, and counterarguments are constructed automatically. The emotional threat of inconsistency outweighs the desire for accuracy. In relationships, dissonance appears when behavior conflicts with attachment. Someone may tolerate neglect while insisting they are happy. They may minimize harm to preserve the belief that the relationship is good. The mind protects connection by adjusting perception. This mechanism operates quietly, reinforcing habits and identities. People do not see themselves as inconsistent. They see themselves as reasonable. The adjustments happen beneath awareness, making contradictions invisible from the inside. Cognitive dissonance also fuels change, but only when discomfort becomes unbearable. When rationalizations fail to soothe, behavior may finally shift. Until then, the mind prefers to rewrite the story rather than rewrite the self. This tension is not a flaw. It is a protective mechanism designed to preserve psychological stability. But when left unexamined, it can trap people in cycles of justification, keeping them loyal to beliefs and behaviors that no longer serve them, simply because consistency feels safer than confronting the cost of change. Effort justification. Effort justification is the psychological tendency to assign greater value to outcomes that required significant effort, struggle, or sacrifice to obtain. When people endure difficulty for a goal, the mind reshapes perception so the result feels worth the cost. This is not conscious dishonesty. It is an emotional correction designed to protect meaning. The brain resists the idea that pain was wasted. If effort led to something disappointing, the discomfort intensifies. To reduce that tension, the mind inflates the value of the outcome. What was ordinary becomes special. What was questionable becomes necessary. The story adjusts so the suffering feels justified. Effort justification explains why people defend choices that hurt them. Grueling jobs, unhealthy relationships, rigid belief systems, and demanding rituals can feel more valuable precisely because of how much was endured. The harder it was, the more the mind insists it mattered. To admit otherwise would mean accepting that the effort was misplaced. This process is rooted in cognitive dissonance. When action and outcome clash, the mind changes interpretation rather than identity. Belief bends to accommodate behavior. Over time, repetition strengthens the belief, making it feel authentic and deeply held. Effort justification also affects loyalty. Groups that require sacrifice tend to inspire stronger commitment. Shared hardship bonds people tightly. The effort itself becomes proof of worth. Questioning the value of the group feels like questioning the self. This mechanism can motivate persistence, but it can also trap people. Suffering becomes a reason to stay rather than a signal to leave. The mind clings to the narrative that pain equals purpose. Without awareness, people confuse endurance with value and commitment with meaning. What began as effort transforms into identity defended not because it is good, but because letting go would make the struggle feel unbearable. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the psychological tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what you already believe. Once an idea forms in the mind, perception quietly reorganizes itself around it. Evidence that supports the belief feels obvious and convincing. Evidence that challenges it feels flawed, irrelevant, or threatening. The mind does not experience this as bias, but as clarity. This process begins the moment a belief takes shape. The brain starts filtering reality, amplifying signals that align and muting those that don't. Neutral information is bent to fit the existing narrative. Contradictions are explained away. Over time, the belief feels stronger not because it is more accurate, but because it has been repeatedly reinforced by selective attention. Emotion intensifies confirmation bias. Fear sharpens attention toward confirming threats. Anger highlights evidence of injustice. Desire magnifies signs of hope. The stronger the emotional investment, the narrower perception becomes. The mind protects beliefs not just because they feel true, but because they feel necessary for emotional stability. Confirmation bias explains why arguments rarely change minds. When confronted with opposing views, the brain goes on defense. Counter-evidence triggers discomfort, which is resolved not by reconsideration, but by dismissal. The belief survives, often strengthened by the challenge. Being wrong feels more threatening than being inaccurate. This bias also shapes memory. Past events are recalled in ways that support current beliefs. Details that contradict the narrative fade. Details that reinforce it sharpen. Over time, the past itself seems to agree with you. History becomes evidence. In relationships, confirmation bias locks people into roles. Someone labeled untrustworthy is remembered for every mistake and rarely for consistency. Someone labeled good is forgiven repeatedly. Expectations create perception, and perception reinforces expectation. Confirmation bias is efficient, not malicious. The brain craves coherence. It prefers a stable story over a fragmented truth. Without awareness, beliefs harden into certainty, certainty into identity. The mind stops asking whether something is true and focuses instead on proving that it always has been. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is the psychological shortcut the mind uses to judge what is likely, important, or true based on how easily something comes to mind. Instead of calculating probability, the brain relies on memory. If an example is vivid, recent, emotional, or frequently recalled, it feels common. If it is hard to remember, it feels rare, regardless of reality. This mechanism exists because the mind values speed over accuracy. In uncertain environments, quick judgments feel safer than careful analysis. The brain assumes that what is easiest to recall must matter most. This assumption works often enough to survive, but not often enough to be reliable. Emotion amplifies availability. Events tied to fear, shock, or excitement leave stronger memory traces, making them easier to retrieve. As a result, dramatic outcomes feel more frequent than they are. Quiet, gradual realities fade into the background, underestimated and ignored. The mind becomes biased toward what feels intense rather than what is typical. The availability heuristic shapes anxiety. When negative outcomes are easily recalled, the world feels dangerous. One story, one image, one experience can dominate perception, making unlikely threats feel imminent. At the same time, repeated exposure to positive outcomes can create false confidence, causing real risks to be dismissed. This shortcut also influences self-judgment. A single failure can overshadow many successes if it is more emotionally vivid. The mind reaches for what hurts most and uses it as evidence. Identity becomes shaped by the most available memories, not the most representative ones. In social judgment, availability fuels stereotypes and snap conclusions. What you have seen, heard, or experienced recently feels like proof. The brain fills gaps using what is easiest to access, not what is most accurate. The availability heuristic reveals how memory quietly rewrites probability. You do not assess the world by statistics, but by recall. What surfaces first in the mind sets the emotional tone for judgment, guiding fear, confidence, and decision-making through what feels familiar rather than what is true. Representativeness heuristic. The representativeness heuristic is the mental shortcut the mind uses to judge probability based on how closely something matches an existing image or stereotype. Instead of carefully analyzing evidence, the brain asks a simpler question: how much does this look like what I expect? The answer feels immediate, intuitive, and convincing, even when it is wrong. This shortcut exists because the mind is designed for speed, not precision. Patterns are easier to recognize than statistics. When something fits a familiar mold, it feels true. A person who looks confident is assumed competent. A story that sounds realistic is believed. The brain mistakes resemblance for likelihood. The representativeness heuristic explains why people ignore base rates and context. Rare events feel common if they match a vivid example. Common events feel unlikely if they don't fit the mental picture. Logic fades behind imagery. The mind prefers coherence over accuracy. Emotion amplifies this effect. Fear sharpens stereotypes. Desire enhances optimism. When emotions are involved, resemblance becomes even more persuasive. The mind clings to what feels right rather than what is probable. This heuristic shapes judgments about people, risk, and the future. Snap impressions form instantly and harden quickly. Once a category is assigned, incoming information is filtered to fit it. Contradictions are dismissed or reinterpreted. The first impression becomes the template. The danger of the representativeness heuristic lies in its invisibility. It feels like insight, not bias. People believe they are seeing clearly when they are actually relying on mental shortcuts built from limited experience. Without awareness, this process quietly reinforces stereotypes, poor decisions, and misplaced confidence. The mind confuses familiarity with truth, similarity with certainty. What feels representative becomes persuasive, and persuasion replaces reasoning. The brain does not ask how likely something is. It asks how much it looks like something it already knows and trusts the answer without question. Anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is the psychological tendency for the mind to rely heavily on the first piece of information it encounters when making judgments or decisions. Once an initial value, impression, or idea is introduced, it quietly sets a reference point. Everything that follows is interpreted in relation to that anchor, even when the anchor itself is arbitrary or misleading. This process happens automatically. The brain grasps the first available information to reduce uncertainty. That initial number, opinion, or description feels solid simply because it arrived first. Adjustments are made afterward, but they rarely move far enough away. The anchor holds. Emotion strengthens this effect. When an anchor is tied to authority, confidence, or fear, it becomes even harder to dislodge. A first impression of a person shapes how their future actions are interpreted. A starting price makes every later offer feel reasonable or insulting. The mind measures without realizing it is measuring against something it never chose. The anchoring effect explains why early experiences carry such weight. First failures define self-expectation. Early praise sets lifelong standards. Initial labels cling even when reality changes. The anchor becomes a silent ruler, used repeatedly without question. This bias also affects memory and belief. Once a narrative forms, new information is bent to fit it. The mind does not reevaluate from zero. It adjusts slightly and moves on. Even when evidence contradicts the anchor, the correction feels uncomfortable and incomplete. Anchoring creates a sense of certainty. The first answer feels closer to truth simply because it exists. Letting go of it requires effort, attention, and emotional tolerance for ambiguity. Most of the time, the brain chooses ease instead. Without awareness, anchors quietly define limits. They set expectations for worth, success, danger, and possibility. The mind rarely asks whether the anchor deserves its power. It simply keeps returning to it, adjusting around it, and calling the result judgment, unaware that the starting point was never neutral to begin with. Framing effect. The framing effect is the psychological phenomenon in which the way information is presented shapes how it is perceived, felt, and acted upon. The facts themselves may remain unchanged, but meaning shifts depending on language, emphasis, and context. The mind does not respond to reality directly. It responds to the story wrapped around it. This happens because the brain is meaning-driven, not data-driven. When information is framed as a gain, it triggers hope and openness. When the same information is framed as a loss, it triggers fear and caution. The emotional response changes even though the outcome does not. The mind reacts to implication, not logic. Framing effect explains why choices feel different depending on wording. A risk described as a chance to lose feels heavier than one described as a chance to gain. The brain weighs loss more intensely than reward, so frames that highlight potential harm command more attention and urgency. Emotion overrides calculation. This effect quietly shapes decisions every day. Health choices, financial risks, moral judgments, and personal boundaries are all influenced by framing. The same situation can feel acceptable or unacceptable based solely on how it is introduced. The mind believes it is choosing freely, unaware that perception has already been guided. Framing also shapes self-talk. How you describe your experiences alters how they feel. A mistake can be framed as failure or feedback. A pause can be framed as weakness or recovery. The emotional weight shifts with the frame, changing motivation without changing facts. In relationships, framing determines conflict or understanding. Words that imply blame activate defense. Words that imply circumstance activate empathy. Meaning is assigned before intent is examined. The framing effect is powerful because it operates invisibly. You rarely notice the frame, only the feeling it produces. Once emotion is activated, the mind searches for reasons to justify it. The frame becomes reality, guiding behavior, belief, and memory, all while maintaining the illusion of objective judgment. Prospect theory. Prospect theory is the psychological explanation for why people experience gains and losses asymmetrically. The mind does not evaluate outcomes based on absolute value, but on perceived change from a reference point. What you have now becomes the baseline, and everything else is judged as either a gain or a loss relative to it. This framing quietly reshapes emotion and choice. Losses feel heavier than gains of the same size. The pain of losing something you already have is more intense than the pleasure of gaining something new. This imbalance is not logical, but it is deeply human. The mind reacts to loss as a threat, triggering anxiety and urgency. Gain feels optional. Loss feels personal. Prospect theory explains why people avoid risks when things are going well, yet take desperate risks when facing loss. When a gain is certain, the mind prefers safety. When loss feels imminent, caution collapses. People gamble not for reward, but to escape pain. Fear bends rationality. This process also shapes satisfaction. Improvements quickly become the new normal, while setbacks linger emotionally. A raise feels good briefly. A pay cut echoes for months. The emotional system anchors to what was, not to what could be. Prospect theory reveals how framing controls decisions. the same outcome feels different depending on how it is presented. A choice framed as avoiding loss feels more compelling than one framed as achieving gain, even when the end result is identical. This mechanism influences money, relationships, health, and identity. People stay in situations to avoid losing what they have, even when better alternatives exist. The mind clings to the familiar not because it is good, but because losing it feels worse than starting again. Prospect theory exposes a quiet truth about motivation. You are not driven by maximizing happiness, but by minimizing pain. What you fear losing often has more power over you than what you hope to gain, and that imbalance silently steers the choices you believe you are freely making. Risk aversion. Risk aversion is the psychological tendency to prefer avoiding losses over acquiring equivalent gains. The mind does not weigh potential outcomes evenly. The pain of losing feels heavier, sharper, and more urgent than the pleasure of winning. Because of this imbalance, people often choose safety over possibility, even when the potential reward outweighs the risk. This tendency is rooted in survival. The brain evolved to protect what already exists. Loss once meant danger, scarcity, or death. That ancient wiring still operates in modern decisions, even when the stakes are symbolic rather than life-threatening. A missed opportunity feels tolerable. A perceived loss feels intolerable. Emotion intensifies risk aversion. Fear narrows attention and exaggerates worst-case scenarios. The mind vividly imagines regret, embarrassment, or failure, while potential benefits remain abstract and distant. What could go wrong feels real. What could go right feels hypothetical. The imbalance pushes behavior toward caution. Risk aversion shapes daily life in subtle ways. People stay in unfulfilling jobs, relationships, or routines because leaving feels like loss, even when staying causes quiet dissatisfaction. Familiar discomfort feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. The known pain is easier to tolerate than the imagined pain of change. This process also affects self-perception. Each avoided risk reinforces the belief that safety equals wisdom. Over time, restraint becomes identity. Courage feels reckless. Desire feels dangerous. The mind begins to interpret hesitation as maturity rather than fear. Risk aversion can protect stability, but it also limits growth. Many forms of fulfillment require uncertainty. Learning, intimacy, creativity, and change all involve the possibility of loss. When the mind prioritizes protection above all else, it narrows the range of experiences it allows itself to have. Without awareness, risk aversion quietly dictates choices. It frames inaction as prudence and movement as threat. The future becomes something to defend against rather than explore. Opportunities pass not because they were impossible, but because the mind decided the cost of trying felt too high. Over time, what was once caution begins to feel like confinement, built not by circumstance, but by the fear of losing what already feels fragile. Loss aversion. Loss aversion is the psychological tendency to feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. The mind does not measure experience evenly. Loss carries more emotional weight than gain, making avoidance of loss a stronger motivator than pursuit of reward. This imbalance quietly shapes decisions, often without awareness. This mechanism evolved to protect survival. Losing resources once meant danger, so the brain learned to treat loss as urgent and threatening. That ancient wiring still operates today, even when the stakes are abstract. Money, status, relationships, time, and identity all trigger the same response. The possibility of losing feels heavier than the possibility of gaining feels hopeful. Loss aversion explains why people cling to situations that no longer serve them. Leaving feels like losing, even when staying causes harm. The mind focuses on what will be given up rather than what could be gained. Familiar discomfort feels safer than unfamiliar improvement because the pain of loss is immediate and vivid, while potential benefits feel uncertain and distant. Emotion intensifies this effect. Once something is perceived as mine, its value increases. Ownership creates attachment, and attachment magnifies fear. The thought of loss activates anxiety, narrowing attention and pushing behavior toward preservation rather than growth. People defend what they have even when it limits them. Loss aversion also distorts decision-making. Individuals may avoid beneficial risks, settle for less, or reject change simply to prevent loss. The mind treats maintaining the current state as success, even if the current state is unfulfilling. Progress becomes threatening because it requires letting go. This tendency shapes identity as well. People hold on to beliefs, roles, and self-images long after they have outgrown them. Changing feels like losing a part of the self. The brain resists not because change is wrong, but because loss feels dangerous. Loss aversion reveals that much of human behavior is not driven by desire for more, but by fear of less. The mind is not chasing happiness as much as it is guarding against pain. In that guarding, opportunities are missed, potential is delayed, and comfort becomes a cage disguised as safety. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is the psychological capacity to recognize that other people have thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and intentions that are separate from your own. It allows you to imagine the inner worlds of others, to infer what they know, what they feel, and what they might do next. This ability is so automatic that it feels invisible, yet it shapes every social interaction. Without theory of mind, people would appear unpredictable and confusing. With it, behavior gains meaning, a pause becomes hesitation, a tone becomes intention. The mind constantly constructs models of others, filling in gaps with assumptions drawn from experience and emotion. These models guide empathy, trust, and expectation. Theory of mind develops gradually. Early in life, the realization that others do not share the same knowledge or perspective is transformative. It allows deception, cooperation, humor, and compassion. At the same time, it introduces vulnerability. Once you can imagine another's thoughts, you can imagine their judgment. This process explains both connection and misunderstanding. Theory of mind is not accuracy, it is inference. The mind guesses what others think, and those guesses feel real. When the model is wrong, conflict follows. People react not to others' actual intentions, but to the intentions they believe exist. Emotion heavily influences this ability. Anxiety narrows it, causing people to assume negative intent. Trust expands it, allowing for generosity in interpretation. Under stress, the mind simplifies others into threats or obstacles rather than complex individuals. Theory of mind also turns inward. You imagine how others see you, shaping self-awareness and self-consciousness. This can foster growth or fuel insecurity. The power of theory of mind lies in its dual nature. It enables deep empathy and profound misunderstanding at the same time. You never interact with people directly. You interact with the version of their mind you have constructed, and that construction quietly governs how you feel, respond, and connect. Mentalizing. Mentalizing is the psychological capacity to understand behavior, your own and others, in terms of underlying mental states such as thoughts, feelings, intentions, and desires. It is the process by which the mind asks not just what someone did, but why they might have done it. This ability allows you to imagine an inner world behind outward actions, turning behavior into meaning. When mentalizing is active, people are experienced as complex and human rather than predictable or threatening. A sharp comment can be seen as stress rather than cruelty. Silence can be understood as overwhelm rather than rejection. The mind holds space for uncertainty, recognizing that behavior is often driven by invisible struggles rather than fixed traits. Emotion strongly influences this process. Under calm conditions, mentalizing flows easily. Under stress, it collapses. Fear, anger, or shame narrow perception, shifting the mind into certainty. Intentions are assumed rather than explored. Others are reduced to enemies, judges, or obstacles. In these moments, behavior feels personal and deliberate, even when it is not. Mentalizing also applies inward. It allows you to recognize that your own reactions are shaped by emotion, memory, and context. Without it, feelings feel absolute. Anxiety feels like danger. Sadness feels like truth. With mentalizing, emotions become signals rather than commands. This process develops through relationships. When inner experiences are acknowledged and reflected by others, the mind learns to recognize itself. When emotions are ignored, punished, or misunderstood, mentalizing weakens. People then rely more on assumptions and less on curiosity. Mentalizing shapes intimacy and conflict. It allows repair instead of escalation. It makes room for misunderstanding without collapse. When it fails, people become certain and rigid, convinced they know what others mean and what they themselves are. Without awareness, mentalizing shuts down precisely when it is most needed. In moments of emotional intensity, the mind abandons curiosity for protection. Meaning is replaced by judgment. Over time, this loss of perspective hardens relationships and self-understanding, not because empathy disappeared, but because the mind learned that certainty felt safer than not knowing what was happening inside. Social comparison. Social comparison is the psychological process through which people evaluate themselves by measuring against others. In the absence of objective standards, the mind looks outward to determine worth, success, attractiveness, and competence. Identity becomes relative, shaped not by internal values, but by perceived position within a social landscape. This process begins early and operates constantly. The brain tracks status, ability, and belonging automatically. Comparison provides information, but it also creates emotion. Seeing someone ahead can inspire or deflate. Seeing someone behind can comfort or disturb. The emotional outcome depends less on reality and more on interpretation. Social comparison explains why satisfaction is unstable. Achievements feel meaningful until someone else's appears larger. Progress feels slow when viewed beside someone moving faster. The mind shifts focus from personal growth to relative ranking. What matters is no longer how far you've come, but where you stand. This mechanism intensifies in environments of visibility. When others' successes are constantly displayed, comparison becomes relentless. The brain treats curated moments as full realities, forgetting what is unseen. Self-worth becomes vulnerable to incomplete information. Emotion drives the comparison loop. Envy, admiration, shame, and motivation all arise from how the self is positioned. These emotions feel personal, but they are triggered by relational context. The mind learns who it believes it is by observing who it is not. Social comparison also shapes behavior. People adjust goals, suppress authenticity, or overextend themselves to match perceived norms. Identity becomes performative, shaped by how one appears rather than how one feels. This process is not inherently harmful. It helps define norms and guide learning, but when unchecked, it erodes internal reference points. Self-evaluation becomes outsourced, leaving the mind dependent on others for validation. Worth becomes conditional, fluctuating with comparison rather than grounded in experience. Social comparison quietly rewrites self-perception. It teaches the mind to look sideways instead of inward. Over time, identity becomes a moving target, forever recalibrated against others, making peace feel temporary and satisfaction feel just out of reach. Downward comparison. Downward comparison is the psychological process of evaluating yourself against others who are perceived as worse off in order to protect self-esteem and regulate emotion. When confidence feels fragile or circumstances feel threatening, the mind looks for contrast. Seeing someone struggle more can create relief reassurance, or a sense of stability. The comparison happens quickly, often without conscious intention. This mechanism serves an emotional function. By identifying someone who appears to be doing worse, the mind restores balance. Anxiety softens, self-doubt quiets. The nervous system relaxes just enough to regain footing. In moments of stress or failure, downward comparison acts as a buffer against collapse. Downward comparison explains why people seek certain narratives during hard times. Stories of others' mistakes, losses, or misfortune can feel strangely comforting. The mind is not celebrating suffering, but anchoring itself. It uses relative position to regain a sense of adequacy. This process also shapes identity. Repeated comparison trains the mind to define worth relationally rather than internally. Confidence becomes dependent on someone else being below. When no comparison target is available, insecurity returns. The relief is temporary, not transformative. Downward comparison can reduce distress, but it can also limit growth. When comfort comes from contrast, motivation to improve weakens. The mind settles instead of striving. It protects ego at the cost of progress. This mechanism also influences empathy. When people are reduced to reference points, their complexity fades. Their struggle becomes a tool rather than an experience. Emotional distance increases. Downward comparison reveals a quiet truth about self-esteem. When internal stability is low, the mind reaches outward to steady itself. It does not ask who you want to become. It asks who you are not. The comfort it provides is immediate but fragile. As soon as the comparison shifts, the sense of security fades, leaving the same question unresolved. Upward comparison. Upward comparison is the psychological tendency to measure yourself against those you perceive as better off, more successful, more attractive, or more accomplished than you. The mind scans upward automatically, locating people who represent what you lack or hope to become. This comparison rarely feels neutral. It carries emotional weight, shaping self-worth, motivation, and identity. At times, upward comparison can inspire. Seeing someone achieve what you desire can ignite ambition and possibility. The mind interprets their success as proof that improvement is attainable. But this effect is fragile and easily reversed. More often, upward comparison becomes a quiet source of inadequacy. The gap between where you are and where they appear to be feels personal and unforgiving. Emotion intensifies this process. When self-esteem is low, upward comparison turns corrosive. Others' achievements feel like evidence of your failure. Their confidence feels like judgment. The mind selectively highlights what they have and minimizes what you do, creating an uneven ledger that always ends in deficit. Upward comparison is especially powerful in environments where curated success is visible. The mind forgets context, effort, timing, and unseen struggle. It compares your internal experience to someone else's external image. The result feels factual, even though it is deeply distorted. This process shapes motivation in conflicting ways. Some people respond by striving harder, chasing validation to close the gap. Others withdraw, convinced they will never measure up. Both responses are driven by the same belief, that worth is relative and always evaluated against someone else. Upward comparison also erodes presence. Attention shifts from your own values and progress to an imagined standard you did not choose. Satisfaction becomes conditional, postponed until you catch up to someone who is always moving further ahead. Without awareness, upward comparison becomes a default lens. You rarely ask whether the comparison is fair or useful. You simply feel smaller. Over time, the mind learns to locate worth outside itself, scanning upward for permission to feel enough and rarely finding it, no matter how far you climb. De-individuation. De-individuation is the psychological state in which a person's sense of individual identity becomes weakened or submerged within a group. Self-awareness fades, Personal standards loosen, and behavior becomes guided more by the collective than by internal values. The individual does not disappear, but responsibility feels diluted. This state emerges when anonymity, emotional arousal, or group immersion is high. When people feel unseen as individuals, the mind relaxes its usual restraints. Actions that might feel unthinkable alone can feel acceptable when shared. The presence of others creates a psychological cover, allowing impulses to surface with less fear of judgment. De-individuation explains why crowds can amplify behavior, emotion spreads quickly, and self-reflection slows. The individual stops asking, "Is this who I am?" and starts responding to what the group is doing or feeling. The sense of I shifts into we, and accountability blurs. This process can feel freeing. The loss of self-consciousness reduces inhibition, creating feelings of unity and release. People may act more boldly, express emotions more openly, or feel temporarily liberated from self-criticism. In this way, de-individuation can foster bonding and shared experience. But the same mechanism carries risk. When personal responsibility dissolves, harmful behavior becomes easier. Moral judgment weakens when consequences feel shared. Individuals may act against their own values, later struggling to recognize themselves in what they did. De-individuation also operates subtly in everyday life. Online spaces, uniforms, and authority structures can reduce personal accountability. When identity is masked or merged, empathy narrows and impulse gains power. This state reveals how fragile self-regulation can be. Identity is not as fixed as it feels. Under certain conditions, it can thin, stretch, or temporarily vanish into the group. De-individuation shows that behavior is not only about character, but about context, and that the boundary between personal choice and collective influence is far more permeable than most people realize. Social loafing. Social loafing is the psychological tendency for individuals to exert less effort when working in a group than when working alone. When responsibility is shared, personal accountability fades. The mind senses that individual contribution is less visible, less measurable, and therefore less necessary. Effort quietly declines, not out of laziness, but out of perception. This phenomenon emerges because humans are sensitive to evaluation. When individual performance cannot be clearly identified, motivation weakens. The brain calculates that effort will not be directly rewarded or punished, and it conserves energy. What feels like teamwork can become diffusion of effort. Social loafing also reflects trust dynamics. If others are expected to carry the task, the mind unconsciously steps back. This is especially true when confidence in the group is high. Ironically, the stronger the belief that others will perform well, the more likely personal effort will drop. Emotion plays a role as well. In groups, people often feel less ownership over outcomes. Success belongs to everyone. Failure belongs to no one. This emotional distance reduces urgency. The task feels less personal, and personal standards soften. Social loafing affects workplaces, classrooms, and relationships. Projects stall. Resentment grows. High-effort individuals feel burdened, while low-effort individuals remain unaware of their withdrawal. Over time, imbalance becomes normalized. This phenomenon also shapes self-perception. People may believe they are contributing adequately because effort feels average within the group, even if it is lower than their true capacity. The presence of others recalibrates what feels sufficient. Social loafing reveals how context alters behavior. Alone, standards rise. In groups, they blur. Without clear roles or accountability, motivation leaks away quietly. The mind does not decide to care less. It simply senses that caring is no longer required in the same way, and effort follows that signal. Diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility is the psychological process through which individuals feel less personal obligation to act when others are present. As the number of people involved increases, the sense of individual accountability quietly decreases. Responsibility spreads outward, thinning until it barely feels like it belongs to anyone at all. This process is subtle and automatic. No conscious decision is made to avoid action. Instead, the mind assumes someone else will step in. Help will come from elsewhere. Authority will take over. The presence of others becomes permission to remain passive. Inaction feels justified because it feels shared. Emotion plays a critical role. In uncertain or threatening situations, fear freezes the nervous system. Looking to others for cues feels safer than acting alone. When no one else moves, silence becomes information. The lack of response is interpreted as a signal that action is unnecessary, inappropriate, or risky. Diffusion of responsibility explains why people can witness harm, distress, or injustice and remain still even when they care deeply. The internal conflict is often intense. The impulse to help exists, but it competes with doubt, fear of embarrassment, and the belief that intervention is not solely your role. The longer the moment passes, the harder it becomes to break the pattern. This effect also shapes everyday behavior. In groups, tasks are delayed. Effort decreases. Each person assumes others will contribute more. Over time, collective responsibility results in individual disengagement. What belongs to everyone feels like it belongs to no one. Diffusion of responsibility protects the individual from risk, but it also weakens moral agency. Action requires stepping outside the comfort of anonymity and accepting visibility. When responsibility is diffused, courage feels unnecessary and initiative feels optional. Without awareness, this process quietly trains passivity. The mind learns that presence reduces obligation. Moments pass unclaimed. Later, reflection brings confusion or regret. You wonder why you didn't act, forgetting how powerfully the situation shaped perception. Responsibility did not disappear. It dissolved into the group, leaving you feeling uninvolved in the moment and unsettled afterward, aware that something was needed and that you were there when it wasn't given. Bystander effect. The bystander effect is the psychological phenomenon in which individuals are less likely to help when others are present. Responsibility does not disappear, but it spreads so thin that no one feels compelled to act. Each person waits, watching, assuming someone else will step in. In the silence between them, inaction takes shape. This effect is driven by uncertainty and social awareness. When people are unsure how serious a situation is, they look to others for cues. If no one reacts, the mind interprets calm as safety. The absence of action becomes evidence that action is unnecessary. In this way, collective hesitation reinforces itself. The bystander effect also protects the self. Acting carries risk. You could be wrong. You could be judged. You could escalate the situation. When others are present, the cost of stepping forward feels higher, while the cost of staying still feels shared. Responsibility dissolves into the group. Emotion plays a quiet role. Fear of embarrassment often outweighs concern for harm. The mind calculates social risk faster than moral obligation. Helping becomes a public act, and public acts invite scrutiny. Silence feels safer than being seen. This phenomenon explains why emergencies can unfold in plain sight. People do not lack empathy. They lack clarity and perceived authority. Each person assumes someone else is better positioned, more qualified, or more responsible to intervene. The bystander effect also appears in everyday life. Unaddressed harm, ignored discomfort, and silent agreement all follow the same pattern. When many witness something, accountability feels optional. The more people involved, the easier it is to feel uninvolved. This effect reveals how morality is shaped by context. People do not fail to act because they are cruel, but because responsibility becomes abstract. Action requires someone to reclaim it personally. Without that moment of ownership, situations pass, consequences unfold, and everyone carries a quiet sense that something should have been done, even though no one can say why they didn't move. Group polarization. Group polarization is the psychological process by which people's opinions become more extreme after interacting with others who share similar views. Instead of balancing perspectives, discussion amplifies them. What begins as a mild preference hardens into certainty. The group does not create new beliefs so much as it intensifies existing ones. This happens because agreement feels validating. When others echo your thoughts, the mind interprets that repetition as evidence of correctness. Doubt fades, confidence grows, the belief feels safer because it is shared. Over time, caution dissolves and positions shift toward the edges. Group polarization is fueled by selective exposure. People tend to gather with those who think similarly, limiting contradictory input. Within these environments, ideas circulate without challenge, growing stronger with each pass. What once felt like an opinion begins to feel like truth. Emotion accelerates this effect. Shared outrage, fear, or enthusiasm bonds the group. Emotional alignment becomes a signal of belonging. Expressing stronger views earns approval, while moderation risks exclusion. The group rewards intensity, not nuance. Group polarization explains why collective decisions can feel irrational in hindsight. Individually, members may be reasonable. Together, they drift toward extremes. Responsibility diffuses, and the group's momentum carries everyone further than they might go alone. This process also shapes identity. Beliefs become intertwined with belonging. To question the group feels like questioning the self. Dissent threatens connection, so it is suppressed, often unconsciously. Group polarization reveals how social context reshapes thought. The mind is not only a reasoning system, but a social one. It adjusts beliefs to maintain alignment. In groups, certainty grows louder, complexity fades, and extremes feel justified. What feels like conviction is often the echo of agreement, amplified until moderation no longer feels like an option. Groupthink. Groupthink is the psychological process in which the desire for harmony and belonging within a group overrides critical thinking and honest evaluation. When cohesion becomes more important than accuracy, doubt is silenced. Disagreement feels dangerous. The group moves toward consensus not because it is correct, but because it feels safe. This process often begins with good intentions. People want unity, efficiency, and shared purpose. Over time, subtle pressures emerge. Those who question the group's direction feel tension. Their concerns are minimized, ignored, or reframed as disloyalty. The absence of disagreement is mistaken for agreement, and silence is interpreted as consent. Emotion plays a central role in groupthink. Fear of exclusion, rejection, or conflict suppresses independent thought. Belonging becomes a psychological need that outweighs skepticism. The group offers identity and protection, and in return, the individual offers compliance. Critical thinking feels like a threat to connection. Groupthink distorts perception. Warning signs are dismissed. Alternative viewpoints are caricatured or discredited. The group becomes increasingly confident while becoming increasingly blind. Certainty grows as feedback shrinks. The shared narrative tightens, insulating itself from reality. This process explains how intelligent, well-meaning people can collectively make deeply flawed decisions. Responsibility feels shared, which reduces personal accountability. Doubt feels unnecessary because others appear certain. The illusion of unanimity strengthens belief, even when that belief rests on fragile assumptions. Groupthink also shapes morality. When the group defines what is acceptable, personal values bend. Actions that would feel wrong in isolation begin to feel justified when endorsed collectively. The group becomes the reference point for right and wrong. Without awareness, groupthink quietly replaces conscience with consensus. Individuals stop asking what they truly believe and start asking what will maintain harmony. Over time, the capacity for independent judgment weakens. When the consequences finally emerge, people are often shocked, not because the warning signs were absent, but because questioning the group had stopped feeling possible long before action was taken. Normative influence. Normative influence is the psychological force that shapes behavior through the desire to be accepted, approved of, and not rejected by others. People adjust what they say, how they act, and even what they believe to align with group norms, not because those norms are correct, but because belonging feels essential. The mind equates social acceptance with safety. This influence operates quietly and constantly. Long before conscious reasoning, the brain scans for cues about what is acceptable. Tone, posture, opinions, and emotional expression are adjusted in real time. Standing out triggers discomfort. Blending in brings relief. The reward is not agreement, but inclusion. Normative influence explains why people publicly agree with things they privately question. Dissent carries social risk. Approval carries comfort. The mind weighs these outcomes emotionally, often choosing harmony over honesty. Silence becomes a strategy for self-preservation. This process begins early. Children learn which behaviors earn praise and which invite correction. Over time, these lessons become internalized. The fear of rejection does not require external enforcement. The mind polices itself, anticipating disapproval before it occurs. Normative influence also shapes moral behavior. People are more likely to act kindly, cruelly, courageously, or passively, depending on what is normalized around them. Right and wrong become flexible, guided by what is rewarded or punished socially. Emotion intensifies this effect. In moments of uncertainty, the pull toward the group strengthens. When people feel vulnerable, they are more likely to conform, even against their values. Belonging soothes anxiety, isolation amplifies it. This influence is not inherently harmful. It enables cooperation and social order, but when unchecked, it suppresses individuality and critical thought. People can lose touch with their internal compass, mistaking consensus for truth. Normative influence reveals how deeply human behavior is shaped by the need to belong. Many choices are not made because they feel right, but because they feel safe. The fear of standing alone quietly reshapes identity, teaching the mind to prioritize acceptance over authenticity and comfort over conviction. Informational influence. Informational influence is the psychological process by which people look to others for guidance when they are uncertain. In unfamiliar or ambiguous situations, the mind assumes that others may know something it does not. Their actions, opinions, and reactions become sources of information about what is true, appropriate, or safe. Conformity, in this case, feels logical rather than pressured. This influence is strongest when confidence is low. When you doubt your perception or knowledge, the behavior of others fills the gap. If everyone else seems calm, you relax. If they appear alarmed, fear spreads. The mind treats consensus as evidence. Informational influence explains how beliefs form quickly in new environments. Early cues set the tone. Once a pattern is established, it reinforces itself. People adjust to what appears to be the shared understanding, often without questioning its accuracy. The first interpretation becomes the anchor. Emotion amplifies this effect. Stress, urgency, and ambiguity increase reliance on external cues. In these states, independent thinking feels risky. Following others feels safer. The mind prioritizes belonging and survival over verification. This process can lead to learning and coordination, but it can also lead to collective error. When everyone is uncertain, the group may follow someone who appears confident rather than correct. Mistakes spread as easily as insight. Informational influence also shapes self-trust. Repeated reliance on others can weaken confidence in one's own judgment. Over time, people defer automatically, assuming their perspective is less reliable. This influence operates quietly because it feels reasonable. You are not trying to fit in. You are trying to understand. But when the mind consistently looks outward for truth, it risks surrendering its own perception. What others believe begins to feel like what you know, and the line between learning and losing autonomy grows thin. Interpersonal attraction. Interpersonal attraction is the psychological process that draws people toward one another, creating interest, desire, and emotional pull. It is often experienced as instinctive, immediate, and undeniable, as if it simply happens without reason. In reality, attraction is shaped by a complex interaction of familiarity, perceived similarity, emotional association, and internal needs that operate beneath awareness. The mind is especially sensitive to signals of safety and resonance. People are drawn to those who feel familiar, not necessarily because they are healthy, but because they resemble patterns already known. Shared values, mirrored emotions, or even shared wounds can create a sense of connection that feels deep and natural. The body relaxes in the presence of what it recognizes. Emotion intensifies attraction. Positive feelings experienced near someone are often attributed to the person rather than the context. Laughter, relief, excitement, or vulnerability become linked to their presence. Over time, the mind associates them with emotional reward, strengthening the pull. Interpersonal attraction also reflects unmet needs. Qualities admired in others often point to traits people desire for themselves or feel deprived of. Strength, confidence, warmth, or freedom can feel magnetic when they represent something missing internally. Attraction becomes a mirror as much as a bond. This process shapes relationships quickly. Early impressions carry disproportionate weight. Small gestures are amplified. Flaws are minimized. The mind fills in gaps with hope, projecting potential rather than reality. This projection feels real because the emotion is real. Attraction can be powerful and disorienting. It narrows focus, heightens meaning, and accelerates attachment. Without awareness, it can override caution and blur boundaries. People mistake intensity for compatibility and familiarity for safety. Interpersonal attraction is not random nor purely rational. It follows emotional logic rooted in memory, desire, and expectation. The pull toward another person often reveals more about the inner world of the one feeling it than about the person being drawn to. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is the psychological phenomenon in which repeated exposure to a stimulus increases familiarity, and familiarity quietly turns into liking. The mind does not require logic, benefit, or meaning to develop preference. Simply encountering something again and again is often enough. What was once neutral begins to feel safe. What feels safe begins to feel good. This effect operates beneath awareness. You rarely notice it happening. A face you see often feels more trustworthy. A voice you hear repeatedly feels comforting. An idea you encounter again and again feels more reasonable, even if you once questioned it. Repetition smooths resistance, lowering emotional barriers without argument. The reason this works lies in the brain's relationship with uncertainty. Novelty demands effort. Familiarity requires less processing. The nervous system interprets ease as safety. When something becomes predictable, the body relaxes. That relaxation is subtly experienced as preference. Liking is not always about quality. It is often about comfort. The mere exposure effect explains why people grow attached to routines, environments, and even relationships that offer little reward. Repeated contact builds emotional warmth simply because it reduces uncertainty. What is known feels less threatening than what is unknown, even if the unknown holds greater potential. This phenomenon also shapes beliefs. Ideas repeated frequently begin to feel true, not because they are accurate, but because they are familiar. The mind mistakes ease of processing for validity. Over time, repetition creates acceptance without persuasion. Emotion strengthens this effect. Exposure that occurs without negative consequence builds trust. The brain learns that nothing bad happened last time, so it relaxes further the next time. Gradually, neutrality shifts toward preference. The mere exposure effect reveals how attachment can form without intention. You do not always choose what you like. Sometimes, liking is the result of simple presence over time. What stays near you quietly earns emotional weight, shaping comfort, belief, and desire not through meaning, but through repetition. Attachment style. Attachment style is the psychological pattern that shapes how you connect, bond, and respond to closeness with others. It forms early, long before conscious memory, through repeated interactions with caregivers. From these early experiences, the mind learns what to expect from connection, whether closeness feels safe, inconsistent, overwhelming, or distant. Those expectations quietly follow you into adulthood. This pattern operates beneath awareness. When intimacy approaches, attachment style activates automatically, guiding emotion and behavior before logic intervenes. For some, closeness brings comfort and security. For others, it triggers anxiety, vigilance, or withdrawal. The reaction often feels personal and immediate, but it is rooted in learned emotional memory. Attachment style influences how people interpret silence, conflict, and affection. A delayed response can feel harmless or deeply threatening. Independence can feel respectful or rejecting. The same behavior carries different emotional weight depending on the attachment lens through which it is perceived. This process explains why relationships can feel intensely emotional even when nothing dramatic is happening. Old attachment expectations are reactivated in present interactions. The body responds as if the past is repeating itself. Fear of abandonment, discomfort with dependence, or longing for reassurance surfaces without warning. Attachment style also shapes self-worth. When early connection was unpredictable, the mind may learn that love must be earned. When closeness felt unsafe, distance becomes protection. These beliefs are not conscious choices. They are emotional strategies developed to survive connection. Change is possible, but it requires awareness and new emotional experiences. Attachment patterns resist sudden transformation because they are tied to safety. The nervous system prefers what it recognizes, even if it hurts. Attachment style quietly organizes how you love, how you fight, and how you pull away. You are not reacting only to the present person. You are responding to what closeness has meant before, carrying old expectations into new bonds, trusting them as truth because they once kept you safe. Internal working model. An internal working model is the psychological framework the mind develops to understand relationships, safety, and the self in connection to others. It forms early, long before it is conscious, shaped by repeated interactions with caregivers and significant figures. From these experiences, the mind builds expectations about how closeness works, what love requires, and whether needs will be met or ignored. This model operates quietly in the background, guiding emotional reactions without announcing itself. It answers questions you don't realize you are asking. Am I safe to depend on others? Will I be abandoned if I show need? Do I have to earn care, or is it freely given? These assumptions feel like truth because they were learned through lived experience, not taught as ideas. Emotion is the glue that holds the internal working model together. Moments of comfort, neglect, unpredictability, or rejection are encoded with feeling, making the model durable and resistant to change. Once formed, it shapes how relationships are perceived. Neutral behavior can feel threatening. Inconsistency can feel familiar. Stability can feel suspicious or undeserved. The internal working model influences attachment patterns. Some people expect closeness to be safe and mutual. Others expect distance, disappointment, or loss. These expectations guide behavior automatically. People seek partners who fit their model, not necessarily those who would treat them best. Familiar emotional dynamics feel like home, even when they hurt. This framework also shapes self-worth. If care was conditional, love feels conditional. If needs were dismissed, needing feels shameful. The model does not just describe others, it defines the self's value within connection. What makes the internal working model powerful is its invisibility. People believe they are responding to the present when they are often reacting to predictions formed long ago. Even when circumstances change, the model remains active, interpreting new experiences through old rules. Without awareness, the past continues to speak through expectation, shaping intimacy, trust, and fear in every relationship that follows. Separation anxiety. Separation anxiety is the psychological response to perceived or actual distance from an attachment figure, place, or source of emotional safety. It is not simply fear of being alone, but fear of losing regulation. The presence of what feels safe helps the nervous system stay balanced. When that presence is threatened, the body reacts before the mind can explain why. This response is rooted in early attachment. From infancy, closeness signals protection, distance signals risk. When separation occurs, the brain activates alarm systems designed to restore connection. Crying, clinging, worry, and restlessness are not weakness. They are survival signals asking for proximity. As people grow, separation anxiety often changes form rather than disappearing. It may show up as distress when a loved one leaves, intense worry about abandonment, difficulty sleeping alone, or unease when routines are disrupted. The anxiety is not about the separation itself, but about what separation represents: uncertainty, vulnerability, and lack of control. Emotion intensifies this response. When attachment feels threatened, the mind searches for reassurance. Thoughts spiral toward worst-case scenarios. The body stays alert, waiting for reunion. Rational explanations rarely soothe the reaction because the fear originates below conscious reasoning, in the nervous system. Separation anxiety also shapes behavior. People may avoid independence, overattach, or suppress their needs to keep others close. They may mistake proximity for safety and distance for danger, even when relationships are stable. The fear of separation can become stronger than the desire for growth. This condition is not limited to people. Places, routines, and identities can also become attachment anchors. Change then feels like loss. Transition feels unsafe. The body resists movement away from what once regulated it. Separation anxiety reveals how deeply connection is wired into human psychology. Independence is not the absence of attachment, but the ability to tolerate distance without losing internal stability. When that tolerance is strained, anxiety emerges not as failure, but as the mind's attempt to protect what it believes keeps it whole.